Hello everyone and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. I spent the night in a haunted house, and this happened. It was a bitterly cold night in 2018 when I moved into an old, weathered house deep in the countryside. The kind of house where the nearest neighbor was miles away, and the nights were so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. This place had a reputation in the nearby village. People whispered that it was haunted, but I dismissed it as just another old wives' tale meant to scare off city folk like me. The first few nights passed uneventfully. The house was drafty, the floors creaked with every step, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. That was until the fifth night, when everything changed. I was settled in the living room, reading by the dim light of a single lamp. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but I paid it no mind, absorbed in my book. Suddenly, a faint scratching noise broke the silence, coming from the ceiling above me. I paused, listening intently, but the sound ceased as abruptly as it had begun. I chalked it up to a rat or some other small creature, though unease began to creep in. But then the scratching returned, louder this time, as if nails were being dragged across wood. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. The scratching moved, traveling from the ceiling to the walls, circling the room. It was as if something was trapped behind the wallpaper, desperately trying to break free. Panic set in, but I fought to stay calm. I grabbed a broom and banged it against the wall, shouting, get out of here." The noise stopped, and the house fell into an oppressive silence. I took a deep breath, convinced it was over, but then the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath in the air, forming a mist. The rancid odor that followed was unbearable, like rotting meat. The stench was overwhelming, making me gag. I covered my nose, but the smell seemed to seep into my skin, clinging to me. I stumbled back, my eyes watering, and that's when I saw it. In the darkest corner of the room, something was moving. At first it was just a shape, a dark mass growing, stretching toward me. As it came closer, I saw it was a figure, tall and twisted, with long, gnarled limbs and eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. It moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in seconds. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as it reached out with one bony hand, its fingers ending in sharp, black claws. The creature's face was inches from mine now, its breath hot and putrid against my skin. It grinned, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and whispered in a voice that was both a hiss and a growl. "You shouldn't have come here." The room spun, and I felt myself being pulled into the darkness, into the creature's cold, unrelenting embrace. I fought to stay conscious, but it was like being drowned in ink, suffocating and cold. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I woke up the next morning, I was on the floor, the room filled with sunlight. The creature was gone, but the smell lingered faintly. My body ached, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw deep red scratches down my arms and neck, as though I had been clawed by something. I couldn't stay in that house another night. I packed my things and left, not caring where I went as long as it was far from that place. I never discovered what that creature was or why it targeted me. But I know one thing for certain: I'll never forget those glowing eyes or the pure, unrelenting terror that accompanied them. To this day, I still feel like something is watching me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And I'm terrified that next time, I might not be able to escape. But the night's terrors don't end there. Let's delve into another tale of darkness. I worked as a night guard at a grocery store. They left a strange set of rules. I saw the job listing 2 weeks ago. Wanted, night guard at West Market in that 12 a.m. 6 a.m. shift, $21 hour. The whole thing struck me as odd, right off the bat. What kind of grocery store needed a security guard while it was closed? Was the crime really that bad? But I needed the money. Badly. And 2 days later, after a phone interview with a man named Clive, I showed up for my first shift. As soon as I pulled up, I sort of understood why they needed a night guard. The grocery store sat at the edge of a rundown strip mall. Large signs reading "Space for Rent" hung in the store windows, but judging by the dusty glass and flickering street lamps, no one had taken them up on the offer in years. I parked near the front door, and as I approached the building, I saw a woman hurrying away from the store. "You must be Aaron," she said breathlessly. "The night guard?" "That's me. Clive left you some instructions. I put them on the conveyor belt at Register 1. She gave me a polite nod and then stepped around me, heading for the only other car in the parking lot. "Oh, thanks." "Be friendly," my inner voice scolded. "She's your new coworker." I turned around. "Hey, what's your name?" But she was already diving into the car. The door slammed, the car reeled out of the parking space, and then she was gone. So much for a new friend. I turned back towards the store. The parking lot was completely empty now, and the nearest streetlight was flickering with an odd, erratic rhythm. A cold wind swept in, whipping a crumpled paper bag across the parking lot. Well, here goes nothing. I stepped up to the store. The glass doors squeaked as they parted for me, and then I stepped inside. Despite its outward appearance, the store was actually pretty nice inside. Bright fluorescent lights shone from overhead. Jazzy music played from hidden speakers. I headed over to Register 1, where a folded piece of paper was waiting for me. I flipped it open and began to read. "Dear Aaron, welcome to the West family. We sincerely hope you enjoy your first shift. To help you, we've compiled a list of rules that should make your shift as easy as our fresh-baked apple pie. 1. As night guard, you are expected to patrol the store every half hour, making sure nothing is amiss. You may spend the rest of your time in the break room at the back of the store, monitoring the security camera feeds. 2. Do not go down aisle 7. Do not look down aisle 7. 3. If you hear a knocking sound coming from within the freezers in the frozen food aisle, ignore it. 4. If you see a shopping cart that hasn't been put away, please return it to the shopping carts at the front of the store immediately. 5. Do not be alarmed if you find a pool of blood in the meat aisle. Sometimes our meat packages leak. Simply head to the storage closet, get the mop and bucket, and clean it up. However, do not step in the puddle or touch it in any way. 6. If you see a woman in the store, immediately go to the break room and stay there until she leaves. Do not call the police or report a break-in. Do not make eye contact with her. 7. The music we play throughout the store is a pre-recorded disc of instrumental jazz. If the music ever stops, immediately go to the break room and stay there until it resumes. 8. Under any circumstances, end your shift early. Thank you so much, and again, I hope you enjoy your shift. Clive, I stared at the rules, rereading them slowly. They were so weird. A woman in the store? Avoid aisle 7? I'd never been given instructions like this, even when I worked as a bouncer at a nightclub in a bad part of town. Maybe it was a test. They wanted to see how well I could follow instructions, no matter how absurd they were. I looked up at the security camera, staring down at me from the corner. Okay, challenge accepted. I glanced at my phone. 12:06. Might as well get my first patrol out of the way now, before getting settled in. It was odd walking through the store when it was so empty and quiet. All the breads and muffins had been stored away somewhere. White, opaque plastic had been pulled down over the vegetable display to keep the cold in. When I got to the end, I made a right into the meat section. Sheets of plastic had been pulled over the meat coolers too. I saw flashes of red through the gaps, of massive ribeye and sirloin steaks, big slabs of meat with the bones still intact. I averted my eyes. While I wasn't a vegetarian, I never really liked the sight of raw meat. I turned instead to the aisles. Aisle 3, pasta and sauces, all lined up on the shelves, glinting in the fluorescent light. Aisle 4, cookies and snacks. Aisle 5, aisle 6. Oh, right. I wasn't supposed to look at aisle 7. I forced myself to look down at the floor. Yeah, it was stupid, but they told me not to look. In the off chance they were going to check the CCTV footage later to grade my performance, I was going to follow every rule. I continued further into the store. A few minutes later, I found the break room, a nondescript brown door with a little square window cut into it. I took note of its location for later. As soon as I was done with this patrol, I was going to break out my laptop and finish watching Friday the 13th 4. And then I was at the west end of the store, the frozen section. I turned down the aisle, heading back towards the front. That's when I saw it. A shopping cart, parked askew in the middle of the aisle. I huffed. Of all the rules, this was the one that annoyed me the most. I was hired to be a security guard, not a cleanup crew. Wasn't it the employee's job to put all the carts away at closing time? Sighing, I began pushing it towards the front of the store. The wheels rolled smoothly underneath me. The jazz music played softly in my ears. I turned the corner and walked past the cash registers, heading towards the front door. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible over the jazz music. I stopped, straining my ears to listen. Several seconds of silence went by, and then I heard it again. It sounded like someone crying. The hairs on my neck stood on end. There's no one in here. The door's been locked the whole time. Unless a customer had accidentally stayed past closing time. Maybe that employee, the woman I'd run into in the parking lot, didn't notice them, and locked up before they could get out. "Who's there?" I called out, a wailing sob in response. My heart plummeted. It sounded like a woman, or possibly even a child. "I'm coming," I called, breaking into a run. "Where are you?" They didn't reply, they just kept sobbing. I frantically continued in the direction of the sound, calling out to them, telling them everything would be okay. But then I stopped dead. The sound, it was coming from aisle 7. Do not go down aisle 7. Do not look down aisle 7. The rules had been very clear about that. I stopped just short of the aisle, next to an end-cap display of mayonnaise, and carefully positioned myself so I was hidden. "I'm going to help you," I called out. "Can you tell me what happened?" They finally spoke, but they didn't answer my question. "Help me," the voice cried through more sobs. "Please." I wanted to step into the aisle. My foot was already halfway off the floor, ready to run in there and comfort them. But something stopped me. A gut instinct, a little alarm bell going off in my head. Because out of all the aisles, what were the chances this person would be in aisle 7? And besides, they were safe. They were in an empty store with me. It's not like they were in a dark alleyway in the middle of the night. "Come out of the aisle," I called, my voice shaking a little. "Then I'll be able to help you." "Please," the voice replied, "help me. This is stupid. Clearly some person got stuck in here after closing time and they're scared. Just go into the aisle and help them get home." But there was another part of my brain, the instinctual lizard brain part, and it was screaming at me to not move a muscle. "Do you need me to call someone?" I tried. "Your parents or family? The police?" "Help me," the voice pleaded again. The "help me," it sounded the same each time they said it. A little stutter at the beginning, an emphasis on me. It almost sounded like a recording or some AI-generated thing, looping over and over. It didn't sound natural. "Come out of the aisle," I shouted. "Come out, and I'll help you." The sobs got louder, faster, hysterical. "Help me," the voice pleaded again, in a desperate tone that made my stomach twist. I stood there, pressed against the mayonnaise display. Listening to them sob was making my stomach flip-flop, even if it did sound slightly unnatural. I could call the police, I thought. They'd know what to do. Except I'd left my cell phone with my backpack at cash register 1, and getting it would mean crossing aisle 7. The rules didn't say anything about walking past aisle 7. They just said I shouldn't go down it or look down it, and I couldn't just stand here and do nothing. What if it really was someone who needed help? A child who'd sprained their ankle and couldn't get up? "Don't worry, I'm getting my phone and calling the police," I called out. Then I took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold of aisle 7 towards register 1. As soon as I took a step, the crying stopped. Just like that. Violent sobbing, and then, in an instant, nothing. Like a switch had flipped. Then the footsteps started. Loud, slapping footsteps of someone running down the aisle. Way too large to be a child. Coming straight at me. My heart dropped. It's a trap. They're coming for me, and I'm probably going to die here. But as soon as I made it across the aisle, the sound stopped. All I heard were the soft jazz tunes playing through the speakers overhead. I hightailed it to the break room, completely forgetting about the cart I was supposed to return. The break room was small and cramped. The little square window in the door had been blacked out with construction paper from the inside. The only source of light came from the computer screen on the desk, displaying the security camera feeds. I scrolled through the feeds. I quickly noticed that none of them offered coverage of aisle 7. It seemed like the cameras were intentionally placed to avoid that aisle. After searching the grainy black and white video for anything amiss, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. When I finally opened them again, it was almost 12:30. Time for my next patrol. I didn't want to go. I felt safe here, locked up in this little room. But I also knew I wouldn't be safe if I didn't listen to the rules. I shuddered, imagining what would have happened to me if I'd gone down aisle 7, if I hadn't listened. I pulled myself out of the seat and headed for the door. The store was completely silent, no hysterical sobbing or pounding footsteps. I started my patrol near the back, walking up aisle 17. Cans of food glinted on the shelves as I passed, but when I glanced at them, I didn't see any labels I recognized. No chef ravioli or giant green men, just generically labeled cans of meat stew. In fact, all the aisle had was meat stew. The same cans, over and over and over. I reached the end and turned right towards the front of the store. And that's when I realized that I had already broken one of the rules. The cart. I hadn't returned it. It wasn't where I'd left it. Instead of haphazardly parked near aisle 7, it sat next to one of the cash registers. Like some ghost man was checking out his groceries. I paused for a second, hands hovering above the handle. Then I grabbed it and headed towards the door. Outside, the parking lot was pitch black. Not a single street lamp. The shopping carts are only a few feet from the door, I told myself. Just go in and out. It'll take 2 seconds. I did it as quickly as possible. I ran into the darkness, slammed the shopping cart into the row, and dashed back inside. Then I shut the doors and clicked the lock. Okay. That wasn't too bad, I said to myself, letting out a sigh of relief. For a second, I reveled in the peace of the store, the silence, the safety of being locked inside with no one else with me. But then I stopped. The silence. Oh no, the jazz music wasn't playing. How long had it been off? I'd been so preoccupied with returning the cart, I wasn't even paying attention. I broke into a sprint towards the back of the store, cookies and snacks flashing by me. Then I swerved right and sprinted into the break room. I pulled out the list of rules and read them over again. Do not, under any circumstances, end your shift early. Why did he write that? Was it just because he didn't want anyone flaking out on him? Or if I left early, would some horrible fate befall me? Because I really wanted to leave. I opened my backpack, pulled out the soda I'd brought, and popped it open. Took a sip. Scrolled through the security feed. 5 more hours. The next 4 patrols went fairly well. The rules didn't say how long they had to be. So every 30 minutes, I sprinted a lap around the store as fast as I could. The whole thing only took about a minute. Then, for the other 29, I locked myself in the break room. On the second patrol, I heard knocking as I ran down the freezer aisle. It started as light tapping across the glass, then crescendoed into loud thumps, like someone was slamming their palms against the glass doors. As per the rules, I ignored it. I just kept running until I made it back to the break room. On the last patrol, the music had cut out again, so I quickly detoured and got to the break room as quickly as I could, the silence ringing in my ears. And now, here I was in the break room with 3 hours left. I stared at my phone's clock, ticking slowly towards 3 a.m. I stood up, shaking out my nervous energy, preparing myself to sprint. I'd been a runner back in high school, but in the past 10 years, I'd gotten way out of shape. The last patrol had left me panting and breathless, legs aching. My hand closed around the doorknob. My heart hammered in my chest. 3, 2, 1, go. I wrenched the door open and shot out into the store. But I didn't get very far, because there was an enormous pool of blood on the floor. I froze. All the air sucked out of my lungs. I stared at the blood shining in the fluorescent lights. The rules said to clean it up, but that would take at least 10 minutes. I wasn't safe out here. I swallowed. Then I hurried to the supply closet, got a mop and a bucket, and started cleaning as fast as I could. The job was messy. I slid the mop through the blood, then dumped it in the bucket, rinsed and repeated. The soapy water tinged red. A few times it splashed up and almost landed on me, but I did it. I cleaned it all up without touching a drop. Unfortunately, by the time I was finished, it was 3:27, time for my next patrol. I was too tired to run, so I settled for a brisk walk around the store. I headed up through the frozen food, I noticed now there were handprints on the glass doors. Handprints of all sizes, tilted and smudged, except the proportions looked all wrong, with fingers that were too long, too thin. I averted my eyes and kept going. 2.5 more hours. My footsteps clicked against the tile floor. The jazz was starting to grate on my nerves. I must have heard the same looping saxophone melody 20 times now. It made me want to punch something. Sighing, I continued towards the produce section, briskly walking past the aisles. Then I stopped. Something caught my eye in one of the aisles. I backed up and took a better look. Someone was standing in aisle 9. A woman. She wore a blue linen dress and black high heels. Long, black hair cascaded down her back, almost to her waist. She faced away from me, standing still, her thin white arms hanging limply at her sides. In her hand was a basket, filled with cuts of raw meat. The rule echoed in my head. If you see a woman in the store, immediately go to the break room. Do not make eye contact with her. I slowly backed up, as quietly as I possibly could. Then I started down the next aisle, towards the break room. Click, click, click. I heard her footsteps echo against the tile. I hurried my pace towards the break room, but then I stopped. Her footsteps weren't coming from behind me. They were coming from in front of me. I averted my eyes to the floor just as I saw 2 black high-heeled shoes step into the aisle. I stared at the floor. Do not make eye contact with her. Do not make eye contact with her. The words repeated over and over in my head. But I had to get to the break room, and she was standing in my way. All I could see were her shiny, high-heeled shoes, and the little drops of blood that leaked out of the meat packages in her basket, staining the floor. I backed up. That was the only way I could go. I kept my eyes on the floor, careful not to look up, but she was following me. Click, click. For every step I took, I saw a shiny black heel come into view attached to a thin white calf extend. Keeping time with me. I quickened my pace, so did she. Click, click, click. I wheeled around and broke into a sprint. Click, click, click. I ran down an aisle at random and sprinted towards the break room. But then, halfway down the aisle, I stopped. A shopping cart was parked across the middle of the aisle, blocking my way. Not just one cart. Several of them, stacked up in a teetering tower that was nearly as tall as the aisles themselves. I was trapped. I backed away, my heart pounding. Click. Slow, methodical footsteps. Coming towards me, slowly, like a cat stalking its prey. I took my chances. I turned around, sprinted back out into the open, and stepped into the next aisle. Oh, no. I knew it instantly. A tattered lump of gray clothing and sickly, pale blue skin sat on the floor. The person. The creature. The thing folded in on itself, in a pose reminiscent of a crying child. But it obviously wasn't anything resembling a human, with its strange lumps and appendages and complete lack of head. I'd stepped into aisle 7. I immediately reversed direction, but not before the thing unfolded itself and began to move towards me. I whipped around and, screaming, sprinted down the next aisle. Miraculously, I made it to the end in one piece. I veered sharply left towards the break room. Almost there. Almost there. My hand hit the doorknob. I wrenched it open and dove inside. Then I collapsed in the chair, panting. I sucked in a breath, staring at the locked door. Am I really safe in here? Technically, the rules never said I would be safe. Maybe staying in here only decreased my chance of death. I turned my attention to the security camera feed on the monitor. It showed the middle of the store, and from what I could see, the aisles were empty, no trace of the woman. I switched to the next feed, the produce section, empty. I switched to the next one. I jumped. She was standing right there, in front of the break room door. She stood so still, the image could have been a photograph, except for the blood slowly dripping from the meat in her basket. I swallowed and glanced away from the monitor, at the door. My heart slammed into my ribs when I saw her shadow under the door. Go away. Please, go away, I pleaded in my mind. The shadow of her head in the window tilted, as if contemplating her next move. Now I knew why the window had been covered. I forced my eyes away and looked back at the screen. She was still standing there, except there was something different about the way she was standing. I squinted at the grainy black and white image, trying to figure out what was going on. When my eyes finally fell on her heels, I realized they were facing forward, but I was still looking at the back of her head, at the long black hair cascading to her waist. Either her hair was hanging over her face, or she'd turned her head all the way around. It must have been 20 minutes before she began to walk away from the door. I couldn't tell if it was just the low frame rate of these crummy cameras, but her movements looked jerky, her body lurching with each step. It made me sick to watch. When she disappeared from the screen, I let out a breath of relief. My hands and legs were shaking, weak. Okay. Think. The rules said to wait until she left. All I had to do was watch the feed by the front door. As soon as I saw her leave the store, I'd be safe. After a few minutes of sitting there, waiting for my heart rate to return to normal, I forced my fingers back to the keyboard. I pressed the arrow key to move to the next feed. Then the next and the next, looking for the camera at the front of the store. No, her face. Her face filled the entire screen. Her eyes filled me with horror. They were pure white, no pupils, no irises, just pure white eyes threaded with spidery veins. I screamed and jumped back. Then I shut my eyes. The rules said, don't make eye contact. Did that count? Through the screen? I let out a terrified, shuddering wail and covered my face with my hands, my entire body shaking. When I finally took a peek through my fingers, I saw her, rapidly scaling down the wall, away from the camera on the ceiling, like some kind of spider. Then she pushed through the glass doors and disappeared into the night. She'd left. I was safe, or as safe as I could be, in this cursed grocery store. I glanced at the clock, 3:58 a.m. Time to patrol? I really didn't want to. But I forced myself to swing the door open and run as fast as I could through the store. I saw shopping carts stacked in teetering towers, heard hands pounding against the freezer doors, saw little spots of blood on the shiny tile from the woman as she'd stalked me. And then, a minute later, I was done. I locked myself in the break room and for the first time in years, began to sob. The remaining patrols went by without incident, though I did hear more sobbing from aisle 7 and more banging from the freezers. And then, the hour had come. 6 a.m. My heart soared at the sight of the pink dawn sky through the glass doors. I was safe. I was free. When I glanced out into the parking lot, I saw a few cars pulling in. Disgruntled, groggy employees clutching coffees, heading towards me. As soon as the first one came in, I flew out of the store, ran to my car, and got out of there as fast as I could. I'd never felt such relief, such happiness. I felt like a new man. All of my problems, even my financial ones, seemed dwarfed by what I'd just endured. When I pulled onto the main road, I rolled down my windows and flicked on the radio. But it wasn't my usual classic rock station that blared through the speakers. Instead, I heard the upbeat tune of a saxophone. And as I listened to that horrible, looping melody, I realized that my days as a night guard for West Market may not be over yet. Just when you think it's safe, something else stirs in the shadows. Our next story awaits. Night out at the 10 p.m. diner. The clock had just struck 9:30 p.m. as Eric and I walked down the fog-filled streets, our jackets zipped tight against the night's chill. The city was unusually quiet, the mist swallowing sound and muting the neon lights that flickered above closed storefronts. I stuffed my hands deeper into my pockets, the anticipation building inside me. It was Eric's idea to come out here, to find the infamous diner that only opened at night. I wasn't convinced it was a good idea, but curiosity gnawed at me. "What's the deal with this place again?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the fog, or the unsettling silence around us. Eric shot me a grin, his breath visible in the cold air. "Rumor has it, the diner opens at exactly 10 p.m. and closes before dawn. Some people say it's older than the city itself." He paused for effect. "And, of course, the rules. The rules. That's what everyone talked about. Online forums, late-night campus discussions, and even random whispers at parties. The 10 p.m. diner's rules were legendary, each more bizarre than the last. Yet despite all the speculation, no one seemed to know why they existed or who enforced them. Some said it was just a quirky tradition to attract business. Others hinted at something darker, a power that the diner held over its patrons. "You think it's just a gimmick?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Probably," Eric replied. "But isn't that part of the fun? Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" I forced a smile, more to convince myself than him. The idea of the rules didn't sit right with me. But then again, how weird could a diner really be? We turned a corner and the building came into view. It sat at the end of a darkened alleyway wedged between two ancient brick structures. "There it is," Eric said, nodding toward the dim glow ahead. The diner's facade was cracked and faded, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside. The only sign of life was a flickering neon sign above the entrance, casting a sickly yellow light onto the wet pavement. As we approached, I noticed a faint outline of people through the grime-streaked glass. My stomach tightened. "You ready?" Eric asked, grabbing the door handle. I hesitated for a split second, glancing at the street behind us. The fog seemed thicker now, swallowing everything in its path. It felt like the world was closing in on us. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, let's do this." Eric pulled the door open, and we stepped inside. A wave of warm, stale air hit me, carrying with it the scent of old leather, coffee, and a faint hint of something metallic. The interior was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. I scanned the room, trying to get my bearings. Booths lined the walls, their red leather cushions cracked and worn with age. A long counter stretched out on the opposite side, stools with torn fabric tops lined up neatly. There were a few customers scattered around. A man sitting by himself, staring at the window, an elderly couple whispering over their cups, and a lone woman with her back to us, spooning sugar into her drink in a slow, methodical manner. But what struck me the most was how still everything seemed. The other patrons barely moved, their actions sluggish, like they were part of some strange, slow-motion dream. I glanced at Eric, who appeared to have noticed it too. His usual bravado seemed to wane slightly as we walked toward an empty booth in the center of the room. The seats squeaked under our weight as we sat down. Eric, always one for theatrics, leaned forward and whispered, "Okay, this place is officially creepy." "Yeah, no kidding," I replied, my eyes scanning the room again. Something about the diner made my skin crawl, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was as if the place itself was watching us. Our conversation was interrupted by the silent arrival of a waitress. She appeared seemingly out of nowhere, placing two menus on the table without so much as a word. Her movements were smooth, almost robotic, and she left as quickly as she had come. Eric raised an eyebrow at me, clearly unnerved. "Well, that was something," he muttered. "Guess we're not getting the warm and friendly service tonight." I picked up the menu, my curiosity piqued. It felt old, the plastic cover worn and sticky to the touch. Then I noticed the writing on the front, bold, black letters spelling out house rules. Beneath the title was a list of numbered instructions, each one stranger than the last. Rule 1. Never sit facing the entrance unless you are the first customer to arrive. Rule 2. Never greet the staff when they approach, only speak when spoken to. Rule 3. If a stranger joins your table uninvited, offer them a sip of your drink, then excuse yourself to the restroom. Return only when the diner clock chimes. Rule 4. If you hear soft humming while eating, immediately close your eyes and wait for the humming to stop. Rule 5. If a waiter drops something, you must turn away and not look at them until they leave your table. Rule 6. If you hear your name whispered from behind, do not turn around. Pretend you did not hear it. Rule 7. Should your utensil fall, leave it there. Do not bend down to pick it up, or you risk seeing something under the table that shouldn't be there. Rule 8. If you hear footsteps following you as you leave, do not turn around. Slow your pace until the sound fades away. I read through the list twice, each rule more unsettling than the one before. My mouth went dry as I realized how specific they were. These weren't rules for a quaint diner experience. They were warnings. My eyes darted back to Rule 1, never sit facing the entrance unless you are the first customer to arrive. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced over my shoulder at the glass door. "Look at this," Eric whispered, pointing at Rule 4. "If you hear soft humming while eating, close your eyes." What is this place, a haunted house? I forced a laugh, but my heart wasn't in it. "It's probably just some elaborate gimmick," I said, trying to convince myself. "You know, to get people talking." "Yeah, right," Eric replied, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Well, we came here for the experience. Let's just roll with it." He looked at me, waiting for some kind of agreement. I nodded, feeling a tight knot of anxiety form in my chest. We flipped open the menus and pretended to browse the food options, though neither of us really had an appetite. My eyes kept drifting back to the rules, especially Rule 1. "Wait," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We weren't the first ones here, and—" I trailed off, glancing at the door. Through the grimy glass, something moved. I couldn't make it out clearly, just a dark silhouette shifting in and out of the foggy night. It was tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to sway as it stood there. I blinked, trying to focus, but it faded into the darkness. "What?" Eric asked, leaning forward. "What did you see?" "There's something out there," I muttered, not taking my eyes off the door. "I don't know what it was, but it looked—" "Don't mess with me," he interrupted, his voice strained. "This place is already creepy enough." "I'm not messing with you," I snapped, turning back to face him. "I swear I saw something." We both went silent, the unease between us growing thicker. The rules weren't a joke. I was sure of it now. This place had its own set of laws, its own way of operating, and we were already violating one. The tension between us grew thicker with each passing second. I kept glancing at the entrance, scanning for any sign of movement through the glass. My mind replayed the brief glimpse of that shadowy figure I had seen outside, and an icy fear gripped my chest. Eric shifted nervously across from me, tapping his fingers on the table. We sat there in silence, waiting. The waitress reappeared, sliding up to our table without a sound, her hollow eyes staring straight through us. My skin crawled at the sight of her. Remembering Rule 2, I bit my tongue and stared at the menu in front of me, resisting the urge to greet her or even acknowledge her presence. Eric's eyes widened as if he had to force himself to stay quiet. After a long, unsettling pause, the waitress finally spoke, her voice monotone and distant. "What would you like to order?" She didn't ask it like a question, more like a command. The words felt cold and wrong, echoing strangely in the air around us. It was as if the sound didn't belong in this place. Eric coughed and glanced at me, seeking some form of validation. I nodded subtly, indicating he should answer first. He took a deep breath and said, "I'll have a black coffee and pancakes." His voice trembled slightly, but he managed to get the words out. The waitress turned her gaze to me, her eyes boring into mine like a predator, assessing its prey. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her eyes for only a moment before I replied, "Same for me, please." She didn't react, didn't even blink. She just scribbled something onto her notepad and turned to leave. As she walked away, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though a great weight had lifted off my chest. I exhaled slowly, my heartbeat gradually returning to a more regular rhythm. "That was weird," Eric muttered, breaking the silence between us. "Did you see how she looked at us?" I nodded, rubbing my hands together to warm them. "Yeah, like she was judging us for even being here," I replied, keeping my voice low. And the way she spoke, it was like she didn't care what we ordered. Almost like it didn't matter. We sat in silence for a few minutes, staring at each other, too afraid to voice the questions racing through our minds. We both knew something wasn't right. This place felt wrong, like it was bending reality in subtle ways, making us question our perceptions. After what felt like an eternity, the waitress returned with our orders. She placed the coffee cups and plates in front of us with meticulous precision, her movements almost robotic. "Enjoy your meal," she intoned before turning on her heel and drifting back to the shadows. "Did you hear that?" Eric whispered, leaning closer to me. She said, "Enjoy your meal." It's like she was forcing herself to say it. I nodded, my eyes locked on the steaming cup of coffee in front of me. I had an overwhelming urge to down the coffee and leave, to get as far away from this diner as possible. But something inside me, perhaps morbid curiosity, kept me rooted in my seat. I picked up my fork and prodded at the pancakes, watching the syrup ooze slowly down the sides. Then it started. A soft, melodic humming filled the air around us. My heart skipped a beat as I remembered Rule 4. If you hear soft humming while eating, immediately close your eyes and wait for the humming to stop. "Eric?" I hissed, grabbing his wrist. His eyes widened in alarm as he, too, began to hear the sound. "Close your eyes. Now." "What?" he stammered, his fork frozen in midair. "Just do it," I snapped, shutting my own eyes tightly. I heard Eric mutter a curse before he followed suit. The humming grew louder, swelling into a haunting lullaby that reverberated through my skull. It was everywhere, in the air, in my ears, inside my own head. My grip on the fork tightened until my knuckles turned white. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, trying to focus on anything but the unnerving sound. I felt a cold presence sweep through the room, like a gust of wind in an enclosed space. My skin prickled, and the air grew thick and suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to open my eyes, to look at what was happening around us. But I knew that would break the rule. I had to stay still. I had to endure. The humming seemed to circle our table, changing in pitch and rhythm, as if it was studying us, trying to coax us into making a mistake. My breathing grew ragged, my chest tightening with fear. I wanted to reach out to Eric, to feel some form of connection, but I was too afraid to move. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the humming ceased. I held my breath, waiting, listening. I heard Eric's shaky breathing beside me, but no other sound disturbed the air. "It's over," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think we can open our eyes now." I hesitated, then slowly cracked my eyes open. The diner was exactly as it had been before, but it felt different, colder, darker. I glanced at Eric, who looked as pale as a ghost. His eyes were wide, darting around the room in a panic. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice trembling. It was like something was right here. "Yeah," I replied, my mouth dry. I glanced at the other patrons, expecting to see them staring at us, judging us for our fear. But they all sat motionless, eating their meals as if nothing had happened. I glanced down at my plate, my appetite completely gone. The pancakes looked wrong somehow, grayer, like the color had drained from them. I pushed the plate away, my stomach churning. "Let's get out of here," Eric muttered, his eyes darting nervously to the entrance. "I don't care about the rules anymore. I want to leave." I opened my mouth to agree when the waitress returned, appearing silently at the edge of our table. My heart nearly stopped. Rule 2, I reminded myself. Don't speak unless spoken to. I clamped my mouth shut and waited, my heart pounding in my ears. "Would you like anything else?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. I shook my head, avoiding her gaze. She lingered for a moment, her presence sending a chill down my spine, before turning away and gliding back to the counter. "Okay, that's it," Eric whispered harshly. "We're leaving. Now." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. As we prepared to stand up, I glanced at the menu again, my eyes catching the list of rules. Rule 8 loomed in my mind like a warning. If you hear footsteps following you as you leave, do not turn around. Slow your pace until the sound fades away. We weren't done yet. The worst was yet to come. Eric stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, cutting through the oppressive silence that hung in the diner. A sense of dread washed over me. There was a nagging feeling that we were far from done with this place. Eric reached for his wallet, tossing a few bills onto the table. "Let's just go," he muttered under his breath, his eyes wide and darting toward the entrance. He wanted out, and so did I. We started walking toward the door, the air around us seeming to thicken with every step. My legs felt heavy, as though I were wading through mud. The soft clinking of cutlery and hushed murmurs of the other patrons filled the space, but my senses were hyper-focused on our escape. Then, just as we were a few feet from the door, I heard it, the distinct scrape of a chair behind us. My heart dropped. Someone had joined our table. I glanced at Eric, whose face had gone ghostly white. "Oh no," he whispered, barely audible over the diner's eerie ambience. Rule 3. Slowly I turned back to look. There, sitting in my seat, was a tall, lanky figure. The man wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in pictures from decades past. His head was bent forward, his hair hanging over his face like a dark curtain, obscuring his features. A wave of cold swept over me. The atmosphere around him felt wrong, as if he didn't belong in this world. "We have to follow the rule," I hissed at Eric, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get back to the table. Now." With reluctance, we approached the stranger. He remained utterly still, his head angled forward as if studying something invisible on the table. The room seemed to grow darker, colder, the air pressing down on my chest. My palms were slick with sweat, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I grabbed my cup of coffee, my hand trembling, and placed it in front of the stranger. "Here," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "Have a sip." His hand moved in slow, deliberate motions as he reached for the cup. His fingers were unnaturally long and thin, with skin that seemed almost translucent. He lifted the cup to his lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip. A chill crawled up my spine, and I fought the urge to look away. "Restroom," I croaked, nudging Eric. "We need to go." Eric nodded, his eyes locked on the stranger. We backed away from the table, careful not to break eye contact until we reached the restroom door. The moment we were inside, we both exhaled, as though we had just come up for air after being submerged in dark water. "What the hell was that?" Eric rasped, clutching the edge of the sink. "Who was that guy?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaky. But we had to follow the rule. Now we wait until the clock chimes. Seconds felt like minutes as we stood there, listening to our own ragged breaths echoing in the tiny room. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The air was stifling, pressing down on us as if the diner itself was alive, watching our every move. Then, the cafe clock outside began to chime. 1, 2, 3 chimes. We exchanged a glance, swallowing the lump of fear lodged in our throats. It was time to return. As we stepped out of the restroom, we dared to approach the table. It was empty. The stranger was gone, leaving only our 2 cups and the uneaten plates of pancakes behind. I exhaled shakily, but my relief was short-lived. As we turned back toward the entrance, something metallic clattered against the floor. I froze. My fork had fallen, clinking loudly as it hit the ground, spinning a few times before settling just under the table. I felt my heart leap into my throat. Rule 7. Should your utensil fall, leave it there. Do not bend down to pick it up, or you risk seeing something under the table that shouldn't be there. "Leave it," I whispered urgently to Eric, who was staring wide-eyed at the fork. "Don't look under the table." He nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear. I could feel the tension radiating off him, his body rigid and tense. We were both aware of what Rule 7 warned us about, and yet the urge to look was almost unbearable, like an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. Then we heard it. A soft, muffled sound coming from beneath the table. My blood ran cold. It was the faint, heart-wrenching sobs of a child, crying softly in the darkness beneath us. My stomach twisted violently, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. "Don't listen," I muttered through clenched teeth, my eyes fixed on a point far away. "It's not real. Just focus." The crying grew louder, more desperate, echoing in the small space of the diner. It was the kind of sound that clawed at your heart, demanding your attention. Tears welled up in my eyes, not from sadness, but from sheer terror. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the noise, but the cries persisted, coming in waves of anguish and despair, each one stronger than the last. Eric shifted uncomfortably beside me. It's just a trick," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "We can't look. We can't." The cries turned into words, garbled and barely recognizable, but unmistakably pleading. "Please, help me." The voice tugged at the deepest recesses of my sympathy, igniting an instinct to look, to bend down and see who or what was under there. I clenched my fist so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. "It's not real," I repeated, my voice trembling. "It's just trying to make us look." The crying continued, now mixed with small, shuffling sounds like tiny feet dragging across the floor. My skin crawled, every nerve screaming for me to glance down and see what was beneath the table. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, the line between what was real and what wasn't blurring under the pressure of the noise. Then, a tiny hand wrapped around the leg of my chair. I stiffened, my muscles locking up in paralyzing fear. It gripped tightly, almost urgently, as though begging me to help. My heart raced so fast I thought it might burst, my breath coming out in short, panicked gasps. "Don't look," I hissed to Eric, fighting the urge to jump up and run. "It's not real." The grip on my chair tightened, and the crying turned into a pitiful wail. My eyes burned from the effort of not looking down, of not acknowledging the nightmare unfolding beneath us. I could feel my sanity teetering on the edge, about to break. And then, as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. The hand released its grip, the crying faded into silence, and the air around us returned to its suffocating stillness. I dared to glance at Eric, who was pale and shaking, his eyes wide and haunted. Did you see that?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, but we didn't look under the table. We followed the rule." He exhaled shakily, his hands still gripping the edge of the table. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, his voice strained. "I can't take this anymore." "Agreed," I replied, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. We stood up slowly, careful not to glance under the table as we backed away. I couldn't help but notice that the rest of the diner continued on as if nothing had happened, the patrons still eating, the waitress still standing behind the counter with her hollow stare. We started toward the exit, moving cautiously. As we reached the door, I heard it, a faint, distant whisper of footsteps following us. My body tensed, remembering Rule 8. If you hear footsteps following you as you leave, do not turn around. Slow your pace until the sound fades away. Don't turn around, I warned Eric, my voice strained. Just walk slowly. We moved forward, each step heavy with fear as the footsteps echoed behind us. I fought every instinct to look back, to see what was trailing us. But I knew if we did, we'd break the rule, and whatever awaited us on the other side of that broken rule would be far worse than anything we had encountered so far. The door was just a few feet away. My hand reached out, grasping the cold handle, and I pushed it open. The footsteps stopped as we crossed the threshold into the foggy night. I turned to Eric, both of us breathing heavily, our faces pale and drawn. "Let's go," I muttered, my voice barely holding together, "and never come back." We hurried down the street, the diner's oppressive aura fading behind us. Neither of us spoke, too afraid of what we might say, of what might still be lingering in the air around us. As we rounded the corner, I chanced a final glance back. The diner stood silent, its dim neon sign flickering in the fog. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow at the window, staring out, watching us. I looked away and quickened my pace. Whatever had happened in there, I knew one thing for certain: we were never coming back. The silence hides many secrets, and our next tale will unveil another chilling one. I started working the night shift for my town's old train station. I found a list of strange rules. So let me quickly explain before I get into the events that changed my life forever. I am a male who just recently turned 21 years old. And last week, a day after my birthday, I saw an ad online for a night shift security guard position at my town's oldest train station. I always hated the night shift position at any job because you always got the weirdos and drug addicts that always seemed to want to hang out and cause trouble or destroy property that you were left to clean up at the end of the night. Unfortunately, I needed this job really bad, as having a kid and one on the way tends to get very expensive. Alright, now that you got the backstory of how I ended up in this mess, let's get on to the actual life-altering events that changed me as a person, and how I ended up seeing the world a bit more differently today. As I walked down the dark, wet stairs that led into the even more dark subway below, I came out onto a slightly lit-up platform with an office sitting at the end of it. I proceeded over to the office door and let 3 consistent but hard knocks fall onto the door. An older man with gray, rough-looking hair that fell down in front of his face peered out the office window and seemed to be sizing me up before answering the door and asking in a raspy voice, "Can I help you?" I looked at the man for a second, taking his appearance in, before replying, Yes. I am here for a job interview." The man cleared his throat before replying, "Come on in, have a seat. My name is Ralph. You must be Jack." I looked at the man for a second, wondering if I was the only one who applied for such a great job. I mean, it was offering $22 an hour. Who would pass that up? "Yep," I replied, now letting my body slouch into the office chair. He looked over some papers that were neatly stacked on the tiny desk in front of him. "Can you start tonight?" He replied, looking up at me, still letting his hair fall in front of his face. I looked back at the man with an angry expression on my face, as this, after all, was a last-minute thing to say to someone who just came in for the interview. Yeah, I guess that will work," I said back, letting a slightly annoyed tone leave my mouth. "Welcome aboard," he said now, standing up from his chair, extending his hand to me in hopes I would shake it. I took his hand and shook it, all the while forcing a smile, as I was still slightly annoyed that I had no time to even prepare. Ralph gave me the quickest tour I had probably ever had at a job. We returned to the office where he blurted out, "Oh yes, I almost forgot. Here, make sure you read this, and good luck." He set an employee manual down in front of me titled "Security Manual for the Second Shift," and left the office, leaving me alone in my thoughts. Good luck? Who wishes someone good luck? I thought to myself as I flipped through the manual, filled with what to do and what not to do in case of a dangerous traveler or a shooting bomb threat, when I came across something that really made me stop and pay attention to what I was reading. Rules for the night shift, in big bold lettering, now sat across the manual's old pages. I began to read carefully, as the last thing I wanted to do was break a company rule on my first night. That is the last thing that I would want to happen to me. Greetings, new hire. I hope you've had the time to get settled in and familiar with your office, as you will be there for most of your shift. Now, each night, there may be some minor inconveniences that may hinder your job here at Redacted Train Company, but just follow the guidelines below, and I am sure it will be no problem to you at all. At exactly 12:05 a.m., you will hear an announcement that train 1002, which is the last train for the night, has arrived on track 7. Pay attention to your cameras. If the train is on any other track but 7, we want you to get up, grab the gun in the desk drawer below you, and shoot every passenger that gets off that train, and return calmly to your office. Don't worry, they are not real people. Every 2 hours after midnight, you are required to do a sweep of the platform to ensure nobody has snuck into the station. If you see a homeless man sleeping against the wall by track 2, simply wake him up and tell him it's time to go. He will not hurt you and will leave when asked if it is anyone but him. Return to your office as fast as you can and do not make eye contact. We cannot stop what will happen to you if you look for too long. At any point between the times of 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., you have to go to the restroom. Please use the one closest to the exit of the station. If, for whatever reason, you use the one closest to your office between those times, and you see you're not alone in the restroom, simply turn around, walk to the exit, punch in the code for the time-locked door, and leave the station. Once outside, call your manager, and he will know what to do. At 4 a.m., you may see a man approach the guard window asking for help. Simply close the window and get under the desk. Ignore him until he is gone, and you will be okay. Trust me, you do not want to help this creature. At 6:55 a.m., you may see a guy in a guard's uniform approach your office window claiming to be your relief. Grab the pistol in the desk and empty the chamber until the thing drops. It is not your relief. Please note that your shift ends at 7 a.m. on the dot. That is when the day guard will appear, no earlier. Refer to Rule 5 for help. I looked back over the rules 500 more times before it started to make any sense in my head. I get it. I thought to myself, they're just trying to pull a prank on the new guy. Real funny guys. I glanced over to the clock, which was to the left of where I was sitting, 12:05 a.m. I nearly jumped out of my seat when a voice crackled to life over the intercom above me. Train 102 now arriving on track 7. All passengers please deboard. Next stop Willow Station, end of the line. A shiver ran down my spine as I heard the voice slowly fade to nothing on that old intercom above my head. I slowly turned to face the camera monitors that sat adjacent to me on the right-hand side of my desk. There on track 7 was an old steam passenger train deboarding its passengers onto the old rickety platform. I sighed a breath of relief as I revisited Rule 1 and realized I would not have to kill anyone tonight. The train was on the right track. Maybe this really was just a joke on the new guy after all. The night proceeded on, and 2 a.m. came and went, with no incident on the patrol of the station's platform. I quickly found myself falling asleep, however, when an uneasy urge of needing to go to the bathroom fell over me. I shot up quick from the desk, feeling like I was about to soil myself, and shot a quick glance towards the clock, 3:25 a.m. I sighed and opened the door to my office and proceeded to tug on the bathroom door that was adjacent to my office, just as I placed my hand on the handle to pull the door open. Rule 3 hit me like a truck, going 80 in a 40. At any point between the times of 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., you have to go to the restroom. Please use the one closest to the exit of the station. If, for whatever reason, you use the one closest to your office between those times, and you see you're not alone in the restroom, simply turn around, walk to the exit, punch in the code for the time-locked door, and leave the station. Once outside, call your manager, and he will know what to do. The words playing in my head as I stood outside the bathroom door. Shit. I yelled out loud as I turned around quickly to go to the opposite side of the station. Just then, as I turned around, a loud noise that sounded like a bottle breaking filled the train station. I turned back to look at the bathroom adjacent to my office and almost fell backwards to the cold, hard ground. There, laying against the wall, was a man who seemed to be sleeping, but was not breathing. "Sir?" I said, holding my flashlight on him. The guy was dressed in a clean blue suit with black loafers on his feet. "You can't." I stopped dead in my tracks when Rule 2 hit me right in the face. Every 2 hours after midnight, you're required to do a sweep of the platform to ensure nobody has snuck into the station. If you see a homeless man sleeping against the wall by track 2, simply wake him up and tell him it's time to go. He will not hurt you and will leave when asked if it is anyone but him. Return to your office as fast as you can and do not make eye contact. We cannot stop what will happen to you if you look for too long. I turned away as fast as I could, as sharp teeth began to appear in the thing's mouth. I continued back into the office as fast as I could, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I continued to watch from the monitors as the thing just got up from the cold, hard floor and vanished out of sight. What the hell is going on? I thought to myself as I let my back slide down the steel office door. I quickly shot a look up at the clock that hanged over my desk. 4 a.m. It was time for my second security check of the station's platform. But I'd be damned if I was going back out there not knowing if that man or thing was still out there waiting for me, wanting to possibly eat me. "Help me. Is anyone there? I need help." A man's voice snapped me back into reality as I heard the whining calls for help. I turned and looked towards the security window, only to be greeted with nobody. "Help me. Hello, is there anyone there? Anyone at all?" The voice continued to echo through the empty station, sounding closer and closer with each cry. I got up to look out the window when a towering creature met my gaze through the window. Remembering the rules, I slammed the window shut on the man or thing that was on the other side and hid under the desk until there was no more noise outside. I began to let another sigh out when it got caught in my throat at the sound of the door to the office opening. I braced myself and was ready to fight whoever or whatever was coming through the door. I picked up the office chair, ready to swing it, when I stopped mid-swing at the sight of a guard raising his hands in defense. "Whoa, I'm Jimmy, the day guard. Please don't kill me," a tall, skinny dude said, looking scared out of his mind. I lowered the chair and took a glance at the clock. 7 a.m. It really was the day guard, which means my shift was over. I actually made it one night in this hellhole. "I'm sorry, Jimmy cut me off with a hand in my face. "No need, it was rough, my first night too. Just go home, get some sleep, and I will see you tomorrow," Jimmy said, smiling as he waved goodbye to me. I just shook my head and walked past him, not knowing what to make of anything anymore. As I walked up onto the street, a bright sun awaited me, as well as a bank notification that $30,000 had been deposited to my account from Redacted Train Company. That was 15 years ago now, and I am happy to say I'm still here and I'm still alive. Goodbye for now. One horror fades, but something more sinister emerges from the dark. Let's continue. Go to Nosleep, Arsh Nosleep, 11 hour ago, Page Turner 637. I fed the hunger and it consumed me. The snow came fast, thicker than I'd ever seen it. 1 minute I was tracking a buck through the pines and the next the world had turned white. No sound, no sign of life. Just me, alone in the north woods of Wisconsin. I couldn't even see my own damn tracks behind me. I should have headed back when the first flakes started falling, but you don't give up on a good hunt. Not when you've been doing this as long as I have. Stubbornness, I guess. That's what my dad used to say. You're gonna die out here one day, boy, if you don't learn when to quit. Well, maybe he was right. By the third day, I had no idea where I was. The snow hadn't let up, and every step felt heavier, slower. The trees all looked the same, like they were closing in on me, watching. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, not even a scrap of jerky left in my pack. My stomach had gone from rumbling to just feeling empty. Hollow. I tried to keep my head on straight, but the cold does things to a man's mind. I started seeing things, just flashes at first. Shadows in the trees, a shape moving just outside my vision. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was. but I knew something wasn't right. Then I saw him. At first I thought it was another trick of the snow, but no, he was real. A man huddled under a pine, shivering, barely holding it together. He looked like he'd been out here longer than I had, face pale, eyes wide and sunken. He didn't say anything when he saw me, just stared. I should have been relieved to see someone. I should have helped him, but all I could think about was how hungry I was. I remember walking toward him, each step like wading through snowdrifts, sluggish and inevitable. His eyes got wider, like he knew. Like he could see the darkness in me, feel the weight of what was coming. Without warning, I attacked him, fast and brutal. Before I knew it, I was on top of him, my hands around his throat, squeezing until the life drained from his eyes. It didn't take long. Too weak to fight back or even scream. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of tearing flesh, the warmth of blood on my frozen fingers, the taste of meat, filling that hollow place inside me. When it was done, I sat there for a while, breathing heavy. My mind felt clearer, sharper, like something had snapped into place. The hunger was gone, but something else was growing inside me. Something darker. I wandered toward the stream not far from where it happened. I needed to wash the blood off. The water was cold, biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I knelt down, cupping the water in my hands, splashing it on my face. That's when I saw it. I looked into the water, expecting to see myself, muddy, worn, but me. Instead, staring back was something else. The face staring back was skeletal and twisted, with hollow eyes that burned like coals. And from its head, long, jagged antlers sprouted, twisting up into the cold sky like the branches of a dead tree. I blinked, splashed the water again, but it didn't go away. The reflection grinned, lips pulling back to reveal sharp, blood-stained teeth. And I understood. It was me, or what I had become. As the fear settles, another nightmare rises. Dare to listen to what comes next. Coulrophobia. Many people are afraid of spiders or heights. My phobia is a fairly common one as well. You see, I am afraid of clowns. When I say I'm afraid of clowns, I really mean it. I can barely even look at the most benevolent clown for more than 10 minutes without screaming and crying. Trying to watch any killer clown horror movie would probably cause my premature death. That being said, I'll tell you about the time that I tried confronting my fear. I doubt telling you this story will help me get over my fear of clowns. However, it might make you afraid of them, so don't continue reading if you don't want another phobia in your life. The story goes as follows. A couple of months ago, I was enjoying the weekend with a friend in his house. Only he and his cat live there, so his house is pretty much the perfect hangout place. We were playing video games while my friend's cat was curled up in my lap. Usually cats hate me, but Bob always had a soft spot for me. He loves to follow me around everywhere I go. He especially loves when I use his fuzzy back as an armrest. After a couple of hours, we decided to buy some whiskey and Coke from the nearby supermarket. We quickly exited the house and walked towards the supermarket, which was only around 3 minutes away. Unfortunately, our trip wasn't as simple as I originally anticipated. Standing right next to the supermarket, we saw the one thing that makes my blood run cold. A clown. A panic attack hit me as soon as I saw the clown. Even though every clown creeps me out, there was just something about this one that made me extremely uncomfortable. He looked like a Ronald McDonald copy, although a very bad copy. The clown was sickly slim and short. His costume had many rips and tears. The makeup on his face was horribly done. It was so awful that his face looked like someone threw a couple of buckets of random paint on it. Even though the clown's appearance alone was frightening enough to ruin my day, what scared me the most was the way he looked at me. Even from a distance, I could tell that he was staring straight into my eyes. He was smiling so hard that it looked like the skin on his face will get ripped off by his unnatural smile. Worst of all, he wouldn't stop smiling at all. His smile seemed to widen with every passing second. At this point, I was completely frozen in place. My friend tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Let's just go and grab the drinks. You don't have to look at that weirdo." I somehow powered through my panic attack and said, "Sure, but I'm gonna stare at the bastard. Can't be a coward forever. It's about damn time I try doing something about my problem." My friend gave me a reassuring look and replied with a simple, "All right." Another even more potent panic attack hit me as soon as I took only 2 steps towards the clown. I started crying, embarrassed. I barely mustered the strength to tell my friend that I'm going back to the apartment. I speed walked back to the house. I collapsed on the couch in tears as soon as I entered. Bob rushed to cheer me up by jumping on top of my back and purring. It didn't take more than 30 minutes for my friend to return. He was proudly carrying 2 bags full of drinks and snacks like they were trophies. He put the bags on the nearby table. Then cheerily, he started talking. You know, that clown wasn't that bad. One guy gave him some money, and then he... Before he finished his sentence, annoyed and exhausted, I said, please, let's just drink. I don't want to hear about it. He nodded understandingly and went to grab the whiskey glasses. Hours passed. After some time of heavy drinking, we fell asleep on the couch. It wasn't an enjoyable nap for me, because a nightmare involving the supermarket clown, which I would rather not describe, woke me up. I groggily went to the spare bedroom, but before going to bed, I realized that neither of us locked the front door. Who knows how long we were asleep? It's not like this is a crime-free neighborhood. Anyone could have entered the house. I walked as fast as I could towards the front door. I checked it, and, as expected, it wasn't locked, so I immediately locked it. I reassured myself that no intruder entered the house. Then I went to bed. While lying in bed, morbid thoughts started attacking my mind. What if someone entered the house? What if the clown we saw earlier followed my friend home and is waiting for the opportunity to surprise us? The sequence of disturbing thoughts was instantly stopped by the sound of soft meowing. I was shocked to hear meowing coming from under my bed, but that shock was immediately replaced by a feeling of relief. Even though Bob was just a cat, knowing he's here to protect me while I try to sleep was oddly putting my mind to rest. After some time of rolling around in bed, I finally fell asleep to the sounds of soft meowing and purring. I woke up early next morning. Considering my paranoia from last night, the sleep itself wasn't too bad. I found my friend playing with Bob in the living room. I immediately told him, Bob's a real lifesaver. If it wasn't for him, it would have been damn near impossible for me to get some sleep last night. He looked at me in confusion and asked, what you mean? Bob was keeping me company. He slept under my bed last night. I said with a smile, nah, he was here with me. He slept right next to the couch. My friend immediately rebutted. I heard him meowing in my room. I responded, I know Bob thinks you're cool and all, but he always sleeps next to me. It's like a ritual of ours, you see? He stopped mid-sentence. His calm demeanor was rapidly substituted by absolute fear. Please, just trust me. Follow me and don't ask any questions until we're out of the house, he said with an unusual shakiness in his voice. He picked up Bob and ran towards the front door. I followed him as he hastily unlocked it. He barely gave me enough time to put on my shoes before pushing me out of the house and then immediately locked the front door behind us. He rummaged through his pockets trying to find his phone. He quickly realized he left it inside the house, so he turned towards me and said with noticeable urgency in his voice, Give me your phone. We have to call the police. I gave him the phone, but before he could use it, I asked him, Can you at least tell me what the hell is going on? You really wouldn't want to know. He brushed me off. I snatched the phone out of his hand. With visible annoyance on my face, I said, I do want to know. I'm not giving you my phone before you tell me why you're acting like a mental patient. Fine, I'll tell you, but please stay as calm as you can. He told me before taking a deep breath. Yesterday, you cut me off before I could tell you why I didn't think the clown was so bad. You see, some guy gave him some money. Then the clown gave the guy some cards with pictures of animals on them. As soon as the guy picked the card he wanted, the clown would mimic the animal that was on the card. He imitated a frog, then a dog. The croaks and barks were exactly like the real thing. If I closed my eyes, I wouldn't notice that a human being is making those sounds. Yeah, so? I asked, very confused by his story. Well, he could also do a cat impression. He said with a defeated look on his face. Close your eyes if you must, but the next story will find you regardless. I've been an Okefenokee swamp ranger for 10 years. The dangers don't always wait for night to fall. For about 10 years now, I've been a ranger in the Okefenokee Swamp Park. It's the largest blackwater swamp in the entire United States and takes up a good chunk of southeast Georgia. The place is massive, home to all kinds of wildlife, from foxes to alligators to the occasional bear. Over the years, I've found that it's not only wildlife that inhabits these swamps, though. There's something else out here. Not human, of course, but the swamp hides its fair share of secrets from the world beyond its waters. One of my earliest memories was during my first year as a junior ranger. I was young, maybe 25 or so when I got the job, and they were drip-feeding me new duties as the days went by. Eventually, I got to the point where I could do patrols myself if there was anything that needed to be checked on, and they finally gave me the keys to the fan boats we would use to get into the deeper parts. That's what gave me my first scare. It was getting dark out, and some folks came into the station, telling us they had been out hiking and lost one of their buddies. Not too uncommon, considering if you take a wrong turn, there's nothing but water and dense trees to find your way back. And unless you've got a keen eye, you're not going to notice the difference. Now the sun was going down, and they say they hadn't seen him in a few hours, despite calling out for him the entire way back. So, it fell on me to go out there and search while Lena, my partner on duty, was the one to take the report. I grabbed the big-ass flashlight we use for night searches, the boat keys, and headed out the door to see what I could find. They said they had come from the western part of the swamp, a more densely wooded region prone to a lot of flooding. Not a great thing right now, as the clouds were coming out for a thunderstorm yet again. Moonlight was in and out, sliding behind clouds and plunging me into darkness every few minutes before re-emerging again for brief illumination whenever it felt like it. The trees above were casting eerie shadows, and every movement from around me made me jump as the night grew darker. Mosquitoes were the worst damn thing out here. Plenty of the bastards were swarming me, almost blocking the floodlight as they swirled around in the beam. It was hard enough seeing anything through the shadows of the trees out here, but seeing millions of tiny bugs make shadows the size of dogs in the distance? That does some weird shit to your brain. The heat didn't help much either, making my clothes stick to my sweaty skin. I was out there maybe 2 hours, moon high overhead and sun long gone now, when the first shower finally came. Rain started falling slow at first, just a drop here and there as thunder gave ominous rumbles in the background. An occasional flash of lightning would overtake my surroundings, completely overpowering the beam of my flashlight and making the entire swamp around visible. That was when I first started to notice them. It looked like people at first, hiding behind trees, obscured in shadows and branches to keep from being seen. Some were taller than others, some a bright, sun-bleached white, while others appeared covered in mold and dirt. The first one I barely caught in the light as it ducked back behind a tree, long white fingers on one hand being the only thing I saw before they slipped back into the darkness behind it. I saw another one 10 minutes later, though this one was much more clear. It was in the middle of the trees, partially submerged in some of the water and muck below. From the waist up, there was a mostly decayed body, stripped by the bugs and weathered down to the bone already, ribs holding rotten ribbons of flesh on them. It disappeared as quickly as my light hit it, one rotting eye still staring at me from its skull as it submerged under the water, leaving me shaking in fear. Despite trying to get a message back to Lena, I didn't have any signal going through on my walkie. I was finally around the space where they said they had lost their friend, and I started yelling for him, despite how scared shitless I was. Everything I had seen up to that point I was able to just rationalize, I guess. It was my first time out in the swamp on my own, especially this late at night, and the weather wasn't helping my nerves. Ahead of me, the trees opened up in a clearing, nothing but a small pond unmarred by roots or trunks sticking through. The rain stopped suddenly, moon appearing from behind the clouds now and shining down on the dark black water below, reflecting its light. There, standing in the middle of the clearing, with hands stretched high into the sky, as if pleading for the moon to come down and meet it, was a body. Hell, a body was probably putting it mildly, as this thing was stripped of all flesh, empty sockets where the eyes should be as it stared up into the moon above. From where I was in the boat, I could see it was dressed in a long, flowing white gown, almost like a wedding dress. I couldn't tell if it was looking in longing, reverence, or both as it reached further toward the moon. It was standing atop the water's surface as if it was a smooth glass floor, not even making ripples across the water, as it was glowing in the moonlight beneath her. As I was watching, more skeletons and decaying bodies emerged from the water, gliding upward to surround the skeletal bride as she continued reaching for the moon above. They grabbed her, dragging her back down below the surface of the water. As the moon was once more hidden by clouds above, I tried shining my floodlight over to see if there was anything still there, but the clearing was completely empty, just shadows dancing off the water's surface again. I turned tail and ran that night. We ended up finding the guy that was missing the next day, somehow wandered right over to one of the nearby highways, though it was a hell of a walk for him to get there. Lena didn't believe me when I told her about the skeletons and decaying bodies in the water, simply looking at me like I was absolutely insane. A year or so later, we were the unlucky site of a murder, or at least it was initially called a murder. Some poor girl's body was found floating in one of the more touristy areas, totally drained of every damn drop of blood. All they were able to find was one puncture wound in between her neck and shoulder. That wasn't from any animal known to be in the park, so Georgia Bureau of Investigations came in to look around. I got paired up to lead a guy named Sully around the swamps, investigating to see if we could find any sign of where she was killed or a possible weapon, even. Good guy, we ended up getting to be friends in the couple of weeks we were going around the whole length of the Okefenokee. One thing we agreed on, the amount of destruction being done to the environment out here needed to stop. There was a mining operation about to start nearby, extracting lithium through strip mines right outside of the damned swamp borders. That was just the latest issue too, because a few of the major train yards had been dumping chemicals for the last few decades that was just now coming to light. God knows, it added to the cancer clusters that have been popping up in the youth around here, taking kids way too damn young. What we found one night, though, almost a week after beginning our investigation, made us both see that the problems were only going to get worse. Another body had turned up a day earlier, causing a whole other fuss as GBI was still trying to get a handle on the situation. This was a big guy, too. They matched him up with a trucker that had gone missing a couple of weeks ago. Big rig found empty and abandoned on the side of the highway nearby. His body was pretty messed up, decay setting in, but he had a similar wound with the same telltale sign. His body was absolutely drained of blood. Sully and I spent the next day tracking deep into the swamp, trying to figure out where it could have come from based on the faint currents through the waters. After about 7 hours of tracking from sunup, we found something. A shallow clearing in the middle of the northeast quadrant, tons of trees clustered around it that kept it mostly closed off. But a small gap between that became a floodgate, essentially when it rained. We theorized that was what was letting the bodies loose, allowing them to drift over to the more populated areas of the swamp where they would be found. Our theory was somewhat backed up almost immediately, and we definitely found the origin point of the dead people. Inside this clearing, bodies were piled up in various states of decay. Every single one was drained of blood, the newest corpse probably being only a few days old at most. Alabaster white skin was glowing against the dark waters, making me feel nauseated in the humid afternoon. The whole area smelled of death, with the bodies adding on to the decay from rotting trees and vegetation. It was worse than the time I found a rotting bear near the park entrance. Poor bastard, almost torn in half by a car that hit him. They all had the same puncture wound, though it was on different sides for some of the bodies, probably just wherever the killer was able to get a good angle in. Sully pulled out his radio to make a call back to the station, letting them know what we had found. Unfortunately, they said it was going to be a bit before more people could come out, thanks to an emergency in town. The downside of living in the rural South is there are only so many resources spread thin over a huge area. We would just have to set up and wait for someone to come out here, but in the meantime, we had our own plan. In the off chance the killer returned, we parked our boat a little ways away downstream, anchoring it to a nearby tree out of sight. Then we got out, waders and boots on to keep from getting totally soaked as we made our way back toward the small clearing. The sun was getting low, and we knew we would have to take a position soon to make sure nothing took us by surprise. There was a little luck on our side, though, because one of the old ranger outposts was nearby. A small, rotting cabin built up on rickety platforms. We crammed ourselves in, getting ready for what could be a long night. Maybe 2 hours passed with nothing. I think I ended up falling asleep on one of the rusty folding chairs left in the outpost. The place was bare, an old landline phone hanging on one wall, a small desk in the corner, and one dingy light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Damned thing didn't even work, and there probably wasn't any power coming in here anyway. Sully got outside and looked around for a little bit while I was snoozing inside, and when he woke up, showed me the reason we didn't have power. The small post stringing wire along for electricity was ripped out of the ground. Nothing but a frayed wire still hanging loose above the water. No doubt that was a major safety hazard, but it's not like anyone ever came out this far. We started checking the further reaches of the swamp a lot more often after this situation, hoping to avoid another pile of bodies coming up like it did. The sun was gone in the sky by the time we realized our serial killer was much, much worse than some awful human. Sully had a fancy pair of night binoculars, and we were trading off back and forth watching the spot to see if anyone was coming. Hell, we were scanning the entire damn area, desperately trying to see anyone coming up before they actually got too close. That way we could get a better look. Our worst fear was that they would come up to their dumping spot with another body to get rid of, probably drained of blood again. Of course, that was a confirmed reality just a few minutes after midnight. Nobody had shown up out here still, with the two of us debating throwing down a GPS marker and heading back to the main station. I was on watch, scanning the area from left to right, when suddenly there was a figure standing in the clearing. Damned thing was huge, standing probably 9 feet tall at least. It was holding another body, likely drained as well, because it flung it next to a tree moments after I caught sight, making it crumple to the water below. I grabbed Sully, pointing in the direction of the clearing, and handing him the binoculars to get a look. His gasps were something I'll never forget, because the thing turned right toward us there. This giant bastard was like Mothman's fucked up southern cousin. Bristles of stiff spines all along its arms and legs, with at least 6 arms sprouting down the body. 2 ended in sharp points, which we initially though was what it used to kill its victims. The others had human-like hands, though the fingers were deadly sharp at their tips. Then it looked to the body it had just thrown aside, something unfurling from its face. The huge red eyes were glowing in the moonlight, hexic patterns reflecting everything around it. As the mouth stretched, I realized it was a sharp, needle-like beak that it then punctured the fresh body with. I couldn't tell what it was doing, but the body started to shiver, something squirming through the still skin as it made itself inward. That was all me and Sully needed to see, because we had no idea what the hell this thing was, other than an abomination against God. The situation with a believed murderer meant we got clearance to carry firearms, and both of us drew ours now. Sully had a rifle, while I just had a standard issue pistol. We gave ourselves a moment to prepare, grabbing a couple of old flares from within the desk in case they might come in handy, and moved out. We made it to the edge of the clearing, still hidden from this damned thing and whatever it was doing. As Sully poked his barrel around the corner, waiting for the right moment, the damned thing turned and locked its giant red eyes with mine. It wasn't human, for sure, and the only thing behind those eyes was the desire to feed, breed, and eat some more. This was the stereotypical southern pest, made into one of my greatest fucking nightmares. Soon as it looked at us, Sully fired a shot off, hitting it in one arm. The damned thing took off flying, both of us firing shots up after it. I think one of our shots found the right mark, because it shot through one of the wings, causing it to lose lift and start falling back down. I fired again, this time hitting it on the lower jaw, taking out the massive needle of a mouth. One more. One more shot, and we could take this thing out. My clip was empty, and when I went to reload, the mosquito man rushed at us, making me fumble the new clip into the dark water. The creature hit Sully, sending him flying backwards before splashing down into the muck behind us. I started to run back towards the outpost, picking Sully up as I went. He had lost his gun when he was thrown, meaning we were shit out of luck when it came to defenses. As we hauled ourselves up onto the outpost platform, I uncapped one of the flares, throwing it at the lumbering creature now wading towards us. It didn't handle the deeper water well, despite the great height advantage it had, and was struggling to pull its feet from the muck below. As we got inside, Sully slammed the door behind us, pulling the deadbolt, which snapped from rust. It was only a moment before a loud thump shook the entire outpost, the creature landing on the platform outside. There was nothing we could do but press ourselves to the back wall, hoping that it might lose interest and leave. Now would have been an awesome time for some of the others to show up like they were supposed to hours ago, but no such luck there. One of the sharp arms busted through the thin wooden door, tearing a piece out as it was pulled back. The thing was coming in now, forcing itself through the small doorway while tearing the wooden panels out from the door and wall. There was little chance for us to get away, but we had to try at least. I opened up the shutter over the back window, exposing a dingy pane of glass roughly half my size. I pulled my arm back, smashing it with my elbow to get out and pulling Sully out with me as the creature got closer in the outpost. Uncapping the last flare, I threw it into the window behind me, letting the bright flame ignite the old, rotting wood inside. We clambered back, trying to make our way from behind the outpost back to our boat before the thing got out. The scream that damn thing let out is something I'll never forget, sounding like dozens of voices crying out at once as the flames licked at its skin. I saw the window burst outward, wall around it being blasted out with flames reaching closer to us. The creature fell out, body half on fire and sizzling as it fell from the platform and hit the water below. We had to get out, water splashing up through my waders at this point and chilling me in the humid air. I could see blue sparks coming a few feet away in the darkness, the live wire on a post that Sully had pointed out earlier. The idea was a risky one, but if it meant I could at least take the bastard out with me, I'd try it. It was gurgling up from the water now, clumsily sloshing its way toward us in the dark water. Nothing was going to stop the bastard, but I made my way as quickly as I could over to the post. My waders were made of rubber, so I hoped this half-baked scheme would work. As the thing got closer, I reached out, grabbing onto it and using its own offbeat momentum to swing it around to the other side of me. It landed right on target, face first into the live wire. I felt a brief shock as my hands let go of its body, noticing smoke rising from it as it convulsed atop the post. A couple of moments passed before the wire shorted out, creature going limp against a post as it died. The outpost was still going up in flames around us as we both lifted the body, bringing it toward the massive pyre. It became that thing's funeral when we threw it on top, letting it burn away before it had any chance to pull some shit and come back at us. There was no sound from it, just the crackling of flames as the outpost burned, smoke rising into the sky above. Screams started coming from the clearing, this time more high-pitched than the last, but all in a terrible discordance that sounded like the choir of hell. We covered our ears, looking back to the clearing as the moonlight illuminated three small bodies, each one maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. One of them took to the air, massive needle mouth extending under the glowing red eyes. This fucking thing was nesting its eggs in the dead bodies, reproducing. I went back to the boat, grabbing the flare gun and a can of gasoline, while Sully made his way to the small ones. They didn't put up much of a fight, thankfully, and he was able to crush them relatively easy underfoot. We started moving every body we found, piling them in the driest place we could before dousing them in gasoline. When they were soaked, we went back to the boat, carefully aiming the flare gun at the pile through the clearing before pulling the trigger. Every body in that pile went up that night. I still don't know who all of them were, and it's likely their poor families may never get closure, but after seeing what that thing had nested in them, I think we did them a service, burning the bodies. Sully and I both gave the same report, though GBI didn't seem to believe it. Every time we've talked about it since we've wondered it was just some freak of nature cryptid or a mutant abomination made by the pollution taking hold. My bet is on the pollution, chemicals probably getting into the mosquito spawn and making, well, these bastards. We've made it a point any bodies come up in the swamp now to watch them for a few days, making sure they don't reproduce into more of the damned things. Despite how terrifying it could be out here, there were times when the supernatural stuff could be oddly beautiful. There's a pretty common phenomenon that I still don't really know if it's real or something more beyond Outworld, but I've seen it enough to know that it's not entirely normal. Swamp lights, small, floating torches in the dark that move of their own accord through the air. Some say they're called ball lightning. Others believe that it's some combination of gas and heat in the air. Those of us in the ranger station have realized it's something a little more than that. This was something we would see probably every other week. Just faint glows in the distance from our outpost, or even along the tree lines while we were out on patrol. There was no telling where they would turn up, but we knew if they were out there, we had some searching to do. Every time a swamp light popped up, floating above the water, it was like a beacon guiding us to something. That something was, unfortunately, usually a body of someone who got lost or just wandered into the wrong area. They're not even terrifying, but more just sad. Every time we would see one, it was a sign to get out the nets and drag the water. Granted, that wasn't always the case, and we think some were just stray spirits left to wander, unable to move on even after their bodies were taken for burial. I think they got lonely sometimes too, just floating out there in search of someone, something, to actually acknowledge that they were once there. One night when I was out on the main station platform, I looked off into the trees to see what almost looked like Christmas lights blinking in and out, but way larger than any of the fireflies that were out here. That sent a bad feeling down my spine, hoping that I wasn't about to stumble upon a mass grave or anything. The lights were just there though, zipping over the water, and if I'm right, chasing each other in play. We dredged the area the next day, but no bodies came up. All I can assume is that they were just lost souls who finally met up with each other, finally enjoying a little company after so long searching in the dark. My last encounter was 2 years ago. Since then, I've mostly retired to life as a desk jockey, taking my leave of having to wander the muck out there. It was bright out midday, and I was out doing some land survey work to make sure local wildlife wasn't being overtaken by some invasive flora we'd had popping up. I was near one of the nicer outposts, this one with some air conditioning and a couple of amenities for anyone that needed them, when I decided to take a break for lunch. Considering fall was coming, I decided to eat my lunch out on the platform and look out at everything. Nature out here was beautiful, with every shade of green imaginable playing off the sunlight high in the sky. I think I ended up sitting there for an hour after I finished eating, just taking in the peace of it all and watching alligators float lazily along in the water beyond. I was zoning out, looking at one of the nearby tree banks a couple dozen meters away, when it began walking through the background where I was staring. This thing was tall. Hell, even taller than the mosquito creature at around 12 feet by my best estimation. It was built like a 10-ton brick shithouse too. Damned thing looked like it could lift a truck if it needed to. Dark brown fur was matted up and down its body, with small, beady eyes staring out above an elongated snout. Ferocious teeth curled down out of its lip from top and bottom, saliva dripping from them. As it traversed the mud across the way, I could see sharp claws gripping trees as it hopped from bank to bank, leaving deep furrows in the bark as it went. I don't know if I made a sound or if it just smelled me, but it stopped dead in its tracks and turned, looking right at me. A howl like I've never heard before ripped through the air before it tore into the water, splashing toward me on the platform. I was up and inside so fast, I shook the entire outpost when I slammed the door, and it shook the whole place again when it bashed up against it. I pulled the deadbolt and chain on the door, hoping to whatever god there was that it wouldn't break through. It kept beating at the door, terrible claws ripping at the other side trying to get in. I don't know what it wanted with me, or if I was just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The beating on the door stopped suddenly. Heavy, plodding footfalls walking around the outpost platform looking for another way in. I didn't have any time to waste. Staying out here, as long as I had taught me that sometimes it was best to defend myself first, no matter what danger it posed to the wildlife. I ran toward the gun locker, pulling out the pump shotgun inside and loading in 2 shells before cocking it. The monster threw itself against the opposite wall from me, desperately trying to break it down to get in. I could hear the ferocious growls constantly, like a rabid dog desperately trying to bite whoever would come near enough. It was about to pass in front of the window now, and I knew I only had one chance to get this right, or I may die out here. I raised the gun to my shoulder, taking aim square at the window and holding my breath, finger on the trigger. The creature suddenly ran from the side, slamming a massive claw against the window to break it open. As it began climbing through to get me, I fired off the first shot, catching it right in the left shoulder. I pumped the gun again, pulling it back up to my throbbing shoulder. The kickback on this thing was more than I was used to, and I was going to be sore for the next damn week afterwards. It still tried coming at me again, but I fired off the second shell, quickly ejecting it and pulling more out to reload. The shot peppered the thing right in the face, blowing off some of the skin around its skull. Despite all that, eye now staring at me, unable to close, and half of its mouth fixed in a wicked snarl, tears of flesh hanging from the side, it turned tail and ran off. Explaining the broken window and huge gashes on the door was surprisingly easy. We all had an understanding at this point that weird shit happens out there, and sometimes the place just needed some repairs when wildlife got uppity or bad weather happened. Most of the official expense reports mention bad weather, but on occasion we would have fun with them, making up random bullshit to send off to the state auditors. Not like they were going to come out here and check on it themselves. I haven't seen the damned son of a bitch since, thank God. I have heard some of the younger rangers tell tales of howling late at night and seeing a massive creature walking through the trees, just beyond the shadows of what they could see. Shining a light on it only causes bright green eyes to reflect back when they see it, and that's usually all it takes for them to turn tail and run. I still work here, but like I said, I stick to the desk jobs now. The younger folk can go out and deal with all the craziness the Okefenokee has to offer. I'll stay right here in the air conditioning. Don't breathe easy yet. What you just heard was only the beginning. Here's what follows. The Silent Watchers. My name is Thomas Reed, and until a few months ago, my life was as ordinary as anyone's. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, close enough to the bustle but far enough away to escape the noise. I worked as a project manager at a mid-sized tech company downtown. The job paid well, though it wasn't particularly exciting, and the monotony of spreadsheets, meetings, and deadlines had become a comfortable routine for me. My apartment building was old, one of those brick structures from the 1950s that had been converted into modern units, though not without its quirks, creaking pipes, drafty windows, and the occasional blackout when the power grid strained. I didn't mind the quiet life. Most evenings I'd come home, fix myself a quick dinner, and either watch TV or read. I wasn't much of a socialite, though I had a few friends from work who'd occasionally pull me out for drinks. But for the most part, I enjoyed my solitude. It gave me time to think, to reflect on life, and in many ways, it allowed me to disconnect from the pressures of my job. My neighbor, Mrs. Granger, was the first sign that something was off about this place. She was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, with thinning gray hair and a hunched posture that made her appear frail, though her sharp eyes suggested otherwise. I would often see her standing in the hallway, staring out of the small window at the end of the corridor as though she were waiting for someone or something. She barely spoke, but when she did, her voice carried an odd, haunting quality. "Be careful in there," she'd said to me once when I first moved in, her eyes fixed on my door as if it hid some terrible secret. I'd laughed it off at the time, thinking she was just a harmless eccentric, but in hindsight, maybe she knew more than she let on. The first time I saw one of them was at work. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting at my desk going through a presentation for a meeting later that day. My colleague, Marcus, had just stopped by to chat about some upcoming deadlines. Marcus was the kind of guy who always had a smile on his face, no matter how stressful things got. He worked in marketing and had an easygoing way about him that made him one of the few people I enjoyed spending time with at the office. "Hey, man," Marcus said, leaning against my cubicle. "You still on for that drink later? We could use a break after this week." I was about to respond when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A dark shape, no, a shadow, standing at the far end of the office, just behind the glass partition near the conference room. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but unnaturally still. For a moment, I thought someone from the cleaning crew was standing there, waiting for the meeting to finish, but when I turned my head to get a better look, there was nothing. "What is it?" Marcus asked, following my gaze. "Nothing," I replied, shaking it off. "Just thought I saw someone over there." He shrugged and smiled. "Long week, huh? We should definitely grab that drink." I nodded, still unsettled. The rest of the day passed without incident, though I found myself glancing around the office more frequently, as if expecting to see the shadow again. But it didn't appear, and by the time I left work, I'd convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, a reflection or something. That night, as I sat on my couch watching the late news, I saw it again. This time, it was in my apartment, standing just outside my bedroom door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, the remote slipping from my hand and hitting the floor with a dull thud. The figure was barely visible in the dim light of the room, more like a smudge in my peripheral vision, but it was there, unmoving, waiting. I slowly turned my head, trying to get a better look, but as soon as I did, it vanished. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty hallway, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. Maybe I was tired, maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something had been there. The next morning, I arrived at the office feeling more tired than usual. My sleep had been restless, plagued by strange dreams of dark corridors and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was alone in my apartment. When I sat down at my desk, I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the shadow I'd seen the night before. I glanced over at the corner of the office where I'd first spotted it, but everything seemed normal. The usual chatter of keyboards, phones ringing, and quiet conversations filled the air. Still, I couldn't relax. As the day wore on, I found myself becoming more paranoid. Every time I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, I would tense up expecting to see the shadow again. It didn't help that Marcus had noticed my distracted behavior. "You all right, man?" he asked, leaning on the edge of my cubicle. "You've been out of it all day." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well last night. Weird dreams." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Weird dreams? Maybe you've been working too hard." "Maybe," I muttered, though I knew that wasn't it. Later that afternoon, as I was finishing up some reports, I saw it again, the shadowy figure. This time, it was closer, standing at the edge of my desk, just beyond the glow of my computer screen. My breath caught in my throat, and I slowly turned my head, hoping to get a better look without scaring it away. But as soon as I moved, it vanished again, leaving only the faintest hint of something wrong lingering in the air. I pushed my chair back and stood up, my heart racing. I needed to get out of the office, to clear my head. I made an excuse to Marcus about needing fresh air and hurried outside. The streets were bustling with the usual lunchtime crowd, but I felt like I was in a different world, disconnected from the reality around me. The shadowy figure had been so close this time, so real. It wasn't my imagination. Something was following me. That night, I came home feeling more on edge than ever. The shadows were following me everywhere now. At work, in my apartment, even when I went for a walk to try and clear my head. They never moved, never spoke, but they were always there, just at the edges of my vision, waiting. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, rubbing my temples. I needed to figure out what was happening, but I didn't know where to start. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. What would I even say? That I was being haunted by shadow people? People would think I'd lost my mind. A knock on my door startled me, and I jumped to my feet. It was late, too late for visitors, and I rarely had anyone over. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but the knock came again, louder this time. I opened the door to find Mrs. Granger standing in the hallway, her frail frame casting a long shadow in the dim light of the corridor. Her sharp eyes were fixed on mine, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something other than disdain in her gaze. There was concern there, even fear. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. My blood ran cold. "Seen who?" "The shadows," she whispered. "They've been following you." I stared at her, my heart pounding. How could she know? "I've seen them before," Mrs. Granger continued, stepping closer. "They start small, just at the edges of your vision. But they get closer. They always get closer." "What are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "I don't know, but they're dangerous. If you let them, they'll drain you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left." I swallowed hard, fear settling like a heavy weight in my chest. "What can I do?" Mrs. Granger's expression darkened. "I don't know if there's anything you can do, but whatever you do, don't acknowledge them. Don't try to confront them. That only makes them stronger." After my conversation with Mrs. Granger, I knew I couldn't just sit around waiting for the shadows to consume me. I had to find answers, and if no one else was going to give them to me, I'd have to figure it out myself. I spent the next day researching everything I could about shadow people, paranormal phenomena, and anything remotely connected to what I was experiencing. I scoured online forums, read articles, and even visited the library, hoping to find something, anything that could explain what was happening to me. Most of what I found was inconclusive, a mishmash of urban legends, personal accounts, and pseudoscience. Some people believed shadow figures were ghosts or spirits, others thought they were interdimensional beings, and a few even claimed they were a form of sleep paralysis. But none of that seemed to match what I was going through. The most unsettling theory I came across was that these shadow figures were entities that fed on life energy. According to some sources, they would latch onto a person, gradually draining their vitality and soul until the victim was nothing more than a hollow shell. The worst part? Once they had a hold on you, it was nearly impossible to get rid of them. By the time I returned to my apartment, it was already dark, and the familiar sense of dread had settled over me again. The shadows were waiting, as they always were, lingering just out of sight, but I could feel them. They were closer now, pressing in on me from all sides. I sat down at my computer, trying to distract myself with work, but my mind kept drifting back to the shadows. What if Mrs. Granger was right? What if these things were feeding on me, slowly draining my life away? That night, I had the worst dream of my life. In it, I was standing in the middle of my apartment, but everything was wrong. The walls were twisted, the furniture distorted, and the shadows were everywhere. They surrounded me, pressing in on me, so close I could feel their cold breath on my skin. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped. In the dream, I reached out to touch one of the shadows, desperate to make sense of what was happening. As soon as my hand made contact, a searing pain shot through my body, and I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, the room still dark around me. But the shadows were there. They were always there now. I could see them, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. Suddenly, the shadows disappeared, but I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus, couldn't think about anything but the shadows. I didn't tell Marcus or anyone else what was happening. It wasn't something I could explain over the phone. But I knew I couldn't keep running from this. I had to confront it. I spent the day preparing. I didn't know how to fight these things, but I wasn't going to let them consume me without a fight. I read about different rituals, protective symbols, anything that might help. I wasn't particularly religious, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. As night fell, I sat in my apartment, waiting for the shadows to come. I could feel them, pressing in on me, closer than ever. The room grew colder, and the lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. This time, I didn't look away. I faced them head-on, refusing to give in to the fear. They didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel their presence intensifying, like they were feeding off my energy. For what felt like hours, I sat there, staring into the darkness, my heart racing, my hands trembling. But eventually, something shifted. The room seemed to grow lighter, the oppressive weight of the shadows lifting, if only slightly. I wasn't free, not yet, but I had faced them, and I was still alive. It's been a week since the shadows first appeared, and they're still with me. They follow me wherever I go, lingering at the edges of my vision, waiting. But they haven't gotten any closer since that night. I don't know how long I can keep this up, but I'm determined not to let them win. Mrs. Granger was right. They feed on fear, on attention. The more you acknowledge them, the stronger they become. I still see them in my dreams, still feel their cold presence when I'm alone, but I've learned to live with it. I don't know if I'll ever be rid of them completely, but as long as I don't give in, as long as I don't let them consume me, I'll survive. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. That night, something felt different. The air in my apartment was colder than usual, even though it was the middle of summer. It clung to my skin, thick and damp, like the air had taken on a weight of its own. I closed the windows, checked the thermostat, but nothing seemed to make the chill go away. It was as if the walls themselves were exhaling, their cold breath seeping into every corner of the room. The shadows were there, as always, hovering at the edges of my vision, never close enough to touch, but always present. Over the past few days, they had stopped moving closer, but I could sense them lingering just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up. But tonight, it was different. They felt bolder. I sat on the couch, the TV playing some mindless show I wasn't paying attention to. The volume was low, just enough to drown out the silence. My eyes flickered toward the corners of the room, watching for movement, waiting for that familiar sensation of being watched. The shadows were there, lurking, but they felt closer. It wasn't just at the edges of my vision anymore, it was deeper, like they were pressing in on me from all sides, just waiting for me to acknowledge them. I glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes until midnight. That was always when they were at their worst, as if the approaching darkness gave them strength. I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake the cold that had settled into my bones, but it was no use. The chill was inside me now. A flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned toward the hallway leading to my bedroom, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the far end of the hall, was one of the shadows. This time, it wasn't just a smudge in my peripheral vision. It was more solid, more defined. It stood tall, motionless, its form vaguely human, but wrong in so many ways. The edges of its body seemed to blur and ripple like smoke, and I could make out no details, just a dark, formless silhouette standing perfectly still, as though it had been waiting for this moment. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought about running. But where would I go? It would follow me. It always followed me. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, as though daring me to acknowledge its presence. The tension in the room was unbearable, the silence thick and oppressive. I could feel my muscles tense, every nerve in my body screaming for me to do something, anything. But I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind raced, trying to remember Mrs. Granger's words. Don't acknowledge them. Don't try to confront them. That only makes them stronger. But it was too late. I had seen it, fully seen it, and it wasn't going away. Slowly, the shadow began to shift. Its body undulated, rippling like a black mist, and it took a step toward me. I gasped, my heart slamming against my ribs. My breath came in ragged, uneven bursts, and I tried to focus, tried to keep my composure. But the shadow was coming closer now, deliberately, each movement slow and deliberate. Its presence was suffocating, the air growing thicker with each passing second. I grabbed the remote, turning the volume on the TV up, trying to drown out the silence, trying to break the spell it had over me. But the shadow didn't care. The noise didn't faze it. Another step. I was shaking now, my hands clammy, my chest tight with fear. The lights in the room flickered, casting jagged, twisted shadows across the walls, amplifying the terror in my gut. I told myself to look away, to ignore it, but I couldn't. My gaze was locked on it, and I felt powerless to break free. And then I heard it. A sound, a whisper. No words, just a soft, almost imperceptible murmur, like something distant, calling from the depths of a dark cave. The sound was faint, but it sent a cold rush through my veins, a terror so primal that I nearly dropped the remote. The shadows stopped, only a few feet away from me now. My eyes widened, my breath catching in my throat as I realized that it was closer than it had ever been before. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me, like something draining the very life from my body. My limbs felt heavy, my mind clouded with a fog of fear and confusion. Another whisper. This time, closer. I clutched the arms of the couch, my knuckles white, my entire body trembling. The shadow loomed over me now, its form darker than any night I had ever known. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing the energy from me like a black hole, devouring the very air around me. In that moment, something snapped inside me. I had lived with this fear for too long. I had let it control me, dictate every movement, every thought, every second of my life. But I couldn't let it end this way. I couldn't let them win. With a surge of defiance, I pushed myself off the couch and took a step toward the shadow. My heart raced, my entire body on edge, but I didn't stop. I took another step, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps, my mind a whirlwind of panic and determination. The shadow didn't move. For a moment, I stood there, inches away from it, the cold radiating from its form seeping into my skin. I could feel its presence wrapping around me, suffocating me, draining me of everything I had left, but I didn't back down. "You don't get to take me," I whispered, my voice shaking but firm. The shadow shuddered, its form rippling like smoke in the wind. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, I thought it might disappear, dissolve into the darkness like it had so many times before. But it didn't. Instead, it retreated. Slowly, its form began to fade, shrinking back toward the hallway, its edges blurring into the shadows that lined the walls. I watched, breathless, as it dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the cold, empty silence of my apartment. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The shadow was gone, for now. But I knew it wasn't over. It's been a few hours since the shadow retreated, and I haven't seen it again. But the apartment still feels cold, colder than it should. The lights are on, the TV is playing, but it feels like the shadows are watching me from every corner, waiting for the right moment to return. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The shadows have been draining me, piece by piece, and I can feel it. I'm not the same person I was a week ago. I'm weaker, more tired. The weight of their presence presses on me constantly, even when they're not there. But I'm still here. I haven't given in, and that's something. As I sit here typing this, I can't help but glance at the darkened corners of the room. The shadows are still there, lingering, but they're keeping their distance, for now. I don't know if I'll ever be rid of them completely, but as long as I keep fighting, as long as I don't let them consume me, I'll survive. At least, I hope I will. For now, that's all I can do. Live with the shadows, face them, and try to hold on to whatever is left of me. Because I know one thing for certain. The shadows never really go away. They're always there, just waiting for the moment when I'm too weak to fight back. And when that moment comes, I'm not sure what will happen. But until then, I'll keep going, even if the shadows are always watching. A brief reprieve from the horror, but only until the next haunting begins. The detour. It was a sunny Saturday morning when I set off on my road trip, the thrill of adventure coursing through my veins. After months of planning, I was finally on my way to the coastal town of Crescent Bay, where I'd spend the next week soaking up the sun and enjoying the ocean. Armed with a playlist of my favorite songs, a cooler full of snacks, and a sense of freedom, I slid into my car, ready to hit the open road. The first few hours were blissful. The windows were down, the wind tussling my hair, and I sang along to the music, feeling like I was in my own little movie. The highway stretched endlessly before me, flanked by lush green fields and distant rolling hills. I stopped for gas in a small town where the locals were friendly, and I picked up a few snacks to keep me fueled. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, and I felt a sense of excitement for the adventure ahead. As the hours passed, the scenery began to change. The flat fields gave way to dense forests, and the roads wound through towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. I decided to take a detour to explore a scenic overlook I had read about. It was supposed to provide stunning views of the landscape, and I figured it would be a nice break from the drive. Following the winding roads that led me deeper into the woods, I reveled in the beauty around me. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the road. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, completely immersed in the tranquility of nature. After a while, I finally reached the overlook, which was even more breathtaking than I had imagined. I parked the car and stepped out, inhaling the crisp, fresh air. As I walked to the edge of the overlook, I was struck by the vastness of the view. The valley below was a patchwork of greens and browns, with a river snaking through it. I stood there for a while, taking it all in, feeling grateful for the chance to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. But as I turned to head back to my car, I noticed a small path leading into the woods. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I decided to explore just a bit further. After all, I had time, and who knew what I might find? I ventured down the path, the sounds of the forest enveloping me, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the distant sound of water flowing. The path twisted and turned, becoming narrower and more overgrown. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I paused, glancing around, but all I saw were trees and the flickering sunlight filtering through the branches. I told myself it was just my imagination and pressed on. After a few minutes, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its wood weathered and gray. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and a sense of unease washed over me. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. What kind of stories could this place tell? I approached the cabin, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I stepped onto the porch. The door hung slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay. Sunlight streamed through broken windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The interior was bare, save for a few pieces of old furniture, a rickety table, a chair with tattered upholstery, and a cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. I felt a chill creep down my spine, but I couldn't help but explore further. I moved cautiously through the cabin, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and dread. As I stepped into what appeared to be a small bedroom, I noticed something strange on the wall, a series of strange symbols carved into the wood. They looked ancient and unsettling, like some sort of warning. I stepped closer, studying them, when I heard a noise from outside. It was a low, guttural growl, echoing through the trees. My heart dropped. Every instinct told me to leave, but I was frozen in place, fear gripping me. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting toward the door. Just as I turned to flee, I heard the sound of footsteps crunching on the leaves outside. Panic surged through me, and I bolted out of the cabin, adrenaline fueling my flight. I ran down the path, heart pounding in my chest. The woods seemed to close in around me, shadows stretching ominously as I navigated the underbrush. I could hear the footsteps behind me growing closer, and I pushed myself to run faster. I burst out of the trees and back onto the main road, my car in sight. I fumbled with my keys, desperation flooding my veins. My hands shook as I unlocked the car and jumped inside, slamming the door shut. I took a moment to catch my breath, glancing out the windows, but there was nothing, only the stillness of the woods. I started the engine, relieved when it roared to life. I didn't look back as I drove away, my heart still racing from the encounter. I didn't understand what had just happened, but I felt a sense of dread lingering in the pit of my stomach. The rest of the drive felt like a blur. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on the road ahead. I turned up the music, hoping it would distract me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin and the sounds I had heard. As I neared Crescent Bay, I finally began to relax, the coastal town's charm welcoming me with open arms. I checked into a small motel and decided to unwind by the beach. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and I felt the tension slowly melt away. That night, I fell asleep easily, the fatigue of the day finally catching up to me. But as I slept, I was plagued by nightmares. The growling echoed in my mind, the shadows from the woods closing in around me. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing, and struggled to calm myself. The next day, I tried to put the events of the previous day behind me. I spent the morning exploring the town, soaking in the sun, and enjoying the local cuisine. But even as I laughed and chatted with the locals, The memory of the cabin haunted me, whispering in the back of my mind. By evening, I decided to take a walk along the beach to clear my head. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. I felt a sense of peace wash over me as I walked, the sound of the waves soothing my nerves. But as darkness fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I noticed fewer people on the beach, and the air seemed heavier, charged with an unsettling energy. I decided to head back, my instincts telling me it was time to retreat. As I walked back to my motel, I heard the familiar growl again, faint but unmistakable. My heart dropped, and I quickened my pace. I glanced over my shoulder, but the beach was empty, shrouded in darkness. When I reached my motel room, I locked the door behind me, trying to convince myself that I was safe. I turned on the lights, but the shadows in the corners seemed to loom larger. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to find sleep. The growl echoed in my mind, and I felt a chill creeping through the room. Just when I thought I might finally drift off, I heard a soft knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing. Who could it be at this hour? "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just another soft knock, insistent this time. "Who is it?" I asked, panic rising in my throat. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help if needed, but before I could reach for it, I heard a whisper, chilling and low. "Let me in." I felt ice run through my veins. It was the same voice from my nightmares. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in quick gasps. "Go away!" I shouted, desperate. Silence enveloped the room, and I waited, frozen in fear. Then the knocking returned, louder and more aggressive. "Let me in." The voice echoed, sending waves of terror through my body. I scrambled to the window, peeking through the curtains, but all I could see was darkness. I was alone, at least I thought I was. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I had to escape. With trembling hands, I grabbed my bag and quietly slipped out the back door, hoping to make it to my car undetected. The night air was cool against my skin, but the fear coursing through me made me feel alive. I ran toward the parking lot, glancing back at the motel. The lights flickered ominously, and I could feel a presence behind me. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Just as I got the door open, I heard a growl behind me, low and menacing. I turned, and my blood ran cold. There, emerging from the shadows, was the figure I had heard at the cabin, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, his smile twisted and predatory. "Where do you think you're going?" He purred, stepping closer, his form shifting in the darkness. I jumped into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My heart raced as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine. "Get away from me," I screamed, but he merely laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in the stillness of the night. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into drive, tearing out of the parking lot. I didn't stop until I was far away from Crescent Bay, the road stretching endlessly before me. I drove through the night, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, the figure's laughter echoing in my mind. Eventually, I found myself on a deserted highway, the moonlight illuminating the road ahead. I thought I was finally safe, but the memories of what I had encountered haunted me. I could still hear the growl, feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. As dawn broke, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, I pulled over to the side of the road, overwhelmed. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, but I knew that the road trip I had envisioned was over. The adventure had turned into a nightmare, and I realized that some roads lead to places we're better off leaving unexplored. I looked back at the empty stretch of highway, knowing that the shadows of the woods and the figure that haunted them would follow me, a chilling reminder that some encounters are better left in the dark. The night deepens, and so do the horrors. Ready for what lurks just ahead? Crazy Invisible in Dorm. After entering college, I ignored the school rules. Gradually, I found that no one in the dormitory remembered me anymore. I screamed loudly in front of them, but they couldn't hear me. I danced wildly in front of them, but they couldn't see me. I hurriedly flipped through the group photos we had taken together in our dorm, wanting to prove my existence to them. But I accidentally discovered that there were two people I didn't recognize standing next to me in the photos. My name is Rachel Lane, and I'm a sophomore in college. With my poor grades, I got into this low-ranking university. After arriving, I felt bored every day. At first, I could obediently follow the school rules and attend classes seriously. Later, I found it meaningless, so I skipped classes every day to sleep and play games in the dorm. That's how I made it to sophomore year. One day, I got down from my bed to go to the cafeteria for food and found my roommates were all downstairs. I asked if they had eaten, but strangely, no one answered me. I walked away awkwardly. When I came back, I realized I had forgotten my key. So I knocked on the door, hoping my roommate would open it for me. After a while, the door opened. It was Samantha, the head of our dorm. I thanked her, but she seemed not to see me and said to the other two in the dorm, "How strange. Someone knocked, but there's no one here." I thought they were playing a game with me, so I went along with it and said, "Yeah, because I'm a ghost." Still, no one responded to me. I felt weird and said, "Have you had enough? I admit your acting is very good." "Hey!" I raised my voice and shouted at them. Next, I made faces and jumped around in front of them, but they still ignored me. I suddenly realized that I haven't seen Rachel all day, one of them said. "Maybe she's sleeping up there again. She played games all night last night. But she can't skip meals. I'll go call her." Samantha called out to my bed. I climbed up to my bed, thinking that if they couldn't see me when I actively moved around in front of them, maybe they could see me if they actively came to find me. Samantha pulled open my bed curtain and saw me looking expectant. She couldn't help but smile. "Get up, it's time to eat." Thank God they could finally see me. I couldn't help but hug Samantha, forgiving them for their earlier game. But gradually, I found that no one in the dormitory remembered me anymore. I screamed loudly in front of them, but they couldn't hear me. I danced wildly in front of them, but they couldn't see me. I confirmed that they weren't acting, but really couldn't see me. Only when they actively wanted to find me could they see me. But slowly, even when they wanted to find me, they could barely remember my name. I hurriedly flipped through the group photos we had taken together in our dorm, wanting to prove my existence to them. But I accidentally discovered that there were two people I didn't recognize standing next to me in the photos. Do you like it? I will update part 2 tomorrow. As one nightmare ends, another begins. What's waiting in the dark this time? I found a hole in my wall that shouldn't be possible, part 1. Subscribe for part 2. Preface: I don't want anyone contacting my family, my work, or anything. I can't have anyone telling them about what's happened, or any stupid ideas that I might be unwell. For this reason, I'll be using a pseudonym for all parties involved. Please respect my privacy and understand that I am not crazy. Everything I tell you is real. Everything I tell you is still ongoing. My wife told me to write down everything I could remember about it, but I only noticed the hole around about 3 days ago. I'll try and write down everything I can recall ever since I found it. 0909-24. There was nothing that stood out this morning. It fell into the backdrop of every other morning of the working week. It was raining. I don't think it stopped raining for a while now. You could probably guess I live in the north, just from the description of the weather. I woke up early, before 7. Like always, I saw my wife Alice, also stirring awake. Before I was ready to leave the comfort of my bed, I felt the unmistakable weight of my cat, Porridge, sat on my chest, slowly caving it in. He made sure that the momentary peace I may have been able to cling to was aptly thrown out. We live on the top floor of an apartment complex that is neither large nor glamorous. The walls and floors are thin. We've had enough awkward encounters with our downstairs neighbor, Michael, enough times to know just how thin they are. I've always had trouble getting to sleep. I've never known exactly why, but in the night I fixate on any sound or sensation. If it's too hot, too cold, if I have any plans in the next few days. But the sound of the footsteps of any neighbor going up the stairs would consistently break my train of thought. I got pretty good at guessing who it was. I could usually tell from the sound of the door opening or the weight of the footsteps. On that morning, I followed my ritual of stretching and cracking every joint in my body, giving my wife the morning sound of a glow stick rolling out of bed. We're a young couple, myself 25, Alice 24, but a couple of years working in a warehouse feels like it's aged me by a few centuries. I got the job when I was a student, and only a few years ago went full-time. The pay was good, but the stability was better. We're saving up for a mortgage, and while our apartment wasn't great, it was cheap. That was all we needed. Living on the top floor and having some hard years as students, my wife and I are no stranger to mold. It was probably listed on the property description with the amount that was there when we first moved in. It covered the roof of both the bathrooms, with each colony of mold seemingly fighting over the damp territory. The bedroom was the worst, though. It looked like a pot of ink had been knocked over the milk-white ceiling. The corners had mold crawling down to the skirting board, and several labor-intensive days later, we had finally made the house breathable, livable. That morning, though, I thought our old friend had made a reappearance on the skirting board adjacent to my bedside. Porridge had leapt off my chest and began to head towards this familiar sight. I quickly left the warmth from the bed, grabbing his sagging stomach and hoisting him away. He doesn't like to be held, but the fleeting warmth from the bedsheets eased this torturous event for him. I took the cat outside of the bedroom and fed him his breakfast. If I was ever curious what Porridge's look of love would be, I know that if I just keep an eye on him as I squeeze out his packet of food, I can see a brief moment where he shows something akin to affection. I remember how cold it got. I was only in my boxers when I took Porridge out of the bedroom and fed him, and I needed to get changed. Every step of the carpet felt like treading on shavings of ice. After the issue with the mold, Alice and I made a habit of keeping the windows open at all times. I remember my pace quickening. I ran on my toes and practically sprinted back to the bedroom. I had to get dressed, and I had to clean the mold off before Porridge develops a taste for it. Our deal has always worked. Alice would make us breakfast, as she started later than me, and I would feed Porridge as I was always able to get out of bed quicker than her. As I walked into the bedroom, she walked past me towards the kitchen. I sat on the edge of the bed and began to get dressed. It was while I was putting on my socks that I saw that the mold on the skirting board was perfectly circular. I didn't measure it, but it was roughly the size of a 5p coin. After getting dressed, I took a Dettol wall wipe and bent slightly to reach and began to wipe over and over again the spot on the skirting board. Every time I felt my finger press against the spot of mold, it felt like it was indenting into the wall. I wrapped another wipe around my hand after seeing it was still there after a couple seconds of wiping. I pressed my index finger along the skirting board and pressed firmly. My nail dipped into a sort of divot, slightly bending it. My first thought was that the mold had somehow eaten through a partial bit of the wooden skirting board. I left the bedroom, leaving the Dettol wipes on the floor, and found Alice in the kitchen. I remember I was angry. We have had countless hours of wiping, bleaching, and repainting walls ever since we moved in as young students. I didn't need to be cleaning first thing in the morning. I was a dick about it. I've since apologized to my wife. I think I said something about the dangers of us having a cat if he was going to be able to eat mold if it grew. I knew that as much as Alice loved me, she doted on him. I didn't know why I was so angry. I could have been hungry or cold or still tired. But I was a dick. She asked what crawled up my arse, and if I didn't want to go into work that day, not to take it out on her. I noticed that Porridge hadn't touched any of his food. Instead, he was just lounging on the sofa, as though he hadn't just had a full night of rest. I think this was one of a handful of times Porridge didn't devour his food without a second thought. We went back into the bedroom, and I showed her the spot. She picked up the previously discarded Dettol wipe and began to wipe it away. She mockingly did some sort of ta-da motion as she took the wipe away. It was still there. We spoke about the divot in the wall, and she asked for another wipe. I watched her as she wrapped the wipe around her pointed nail, as the first few millimeters slid in. She turned around and asked why I had drilled into the skirting board. I asked her to move out of the way, and I laid down as flat as I could and angled my head towards the spot. And she was right. It was a perfectly circular hole that had been drilled into the wall. I asked her why would I ever drill into our skirting board, and she assured me she knows it wasn't her, and she can hazard a pretty good guess if Porridge had learnt to use machinery. There was a few moments where we both realized that whatever this was, wasn't caused by either of us. I don't really know when the feeling dawned on us, but it hasn't left since. The silence in the room gave it ample room to grow. It pulsated in between quick glances at each other. After many shared looks, Alice asked me, "So, who drilled it then?" It felt like she had actualized my anxieties, spoken to them into existence, and left me there to answer them. I don't know. I still don't. I looked into the hole, but I could only see absolute darkness. It was as though a couple inches had been drilled into the brick wall, and that there was nothing in front or on either side. It was just pure black. Even with the light on and the natural light bleeding in from the window, I couldn't see a shred of anything inside it. I pointed out to Alice that there were no wood shavings, bits of brick, flakes of plaster, or anything surrounding the hole. I looked in between the strands of carpet for minutes, desperately trying to see something. I don't know what I wanted to see. I don't know if I would have even wanted to find anything, but there was nothing. It was the same garish carpet that paves the communal areas of the apartment. When I had realized just how long we had been searching in between the strands of carpet, I realized that I had to get to work and had to make my train. The hunger and the anxiety didn't make for a good day in the office. I've been diagnosed with anxiety for a few years now. I worry about many things. I can't drive for fear of the test. I struggle to calm my nerves and find myself awake almost every night for far too long, recycling memories that I need to try and move past. I've been medicated for only a few months, and apart from the mood swings, the freight train of anxiety has subsided. This was the first time since the medication set in that I felt such a wave of dread resurface. I remember on my way out of the apartment, I looked at the skirting board in the communal area outside our door, floor number 3, 2, and 1. There was nothing on any of them. No holes, no mold. Whilst at work, I must have gone through about 100 different theories about the hole. Did someone drill it whilst Alice and I were asleep? Did our landlord install a spy camera in our bedroom? Was the hole always there, and we only just now have noticed? Every thought made the situation worse. I couldn't stop myself from overthinking. The freight train was back. I watched every second on my monitor tick down until 5 p.m., and I was the first out of the office. It made no difference, as I still had to wait for my train, but I knew that my feet were moving faster than my brain. I paced in the station thinking about it. I was overreacting. I was being stupid. I needed to think of something else. I needed to check the train times. I needed to do 1,000,001 different things to distract myself. I thought about it every second of the journey home. It was dark when I got home. The apartment had motion sensor lights in the communal area. Every time I'd get close to the door, I'd see through the obscured glass a bright flickering and then a constant stream of fluorescent light. Every floor had the same system. I'm sure the walls of the lower floors were thin enough that you could see the light through them. I never asked, though. I walked up to the first floor, letting the light welcome me with open arms. And then I searched every step, every corner, and every crevice for anything. I was looking for mold, insects, markings, cracks, anything that would potentially calm my nerves. But there was nothing. It was the same usual signs of life that we've become accustomed to on our daily commute to work. I had left my satchel outside my front door and walked back down the staircase, walking towards Michael's door. After a few knocks, he meandered through. He was old, frail, and had an air of loneliness about him. He always gave Alice the creeps, but I sympathize with him. He's a kind soul. I asked him about any signs of drilling, and after telling him about the situation, he invited me in to have a look about. I think he was hoping for better company, but instead I simply checked alongside any skirting board, wall, or roof. There was no sign of anything. Feeling guilty about barging in and looking around his house, I stayed for a cup of tea. We spoke about how cold it was or something mundane. He asked about my work and I about his, and as soon as it started, we had run out of things to talk about. I had to get back in. I knew that I was putting it off now. I couldn't wait to get back, and now that I was faced with my apartment, I didn't want to go back in. Alice would always arrive last, and it's usually the deal that I'll try and make a meal out of what we have left in the fridge. I said hello to Porridge and quickly began to make something for dinner. I remember it being terribly made, and Alice pretended to like it. Porridge is usually the most affectionate when I come in. After a good few hours alone, he'll take what company he can get. Within seconds of greeting me, he was back on his heated mat. He didn't seem to crave company, rather than to just check out who walked through the door. A few minutes before my disaster of a meal was ready, Alice had arrived. We spoke about our days, about our co-workers, and I was the first to bring it up. I asked if she had thought about the drilled hole at all, to which she haphazardly responded, no. I confessed it had plagued my head all day, and I told her all my conspiracies. She sighed and asked me how anxious I was feeling. I realized how I sounded. She told me that I needed to make sure that I was taking my medication, and if I felt it wasn't working anymore, I needed to speak with my GP to arrange either a higher dose or a different brand of medication. I wasn't upset with her. She put up with my anxious nature for years and was the one to encourage me to get help for it. It was only natural for her at this point to think it had gotten bad again. We ate a surprisingly not awful dinner and watched something on the television until I noticed Alice beginning to lengthen her blinks by the minute. We had both got into pajamas that were 2 sizes too big for the pair of us and embraced the company against the cold night air. I could see Alice shutting her eyes and pretending to me that she was still fully awake. I asked her if was going to sleep, to which she said she was relaxing her eyes. She always says it when she wants to go to bed. I gently guided my half-asleep wife to the bedroom and I laid there with her. I was still wired awake, but I made it a habit to lay with her until she went to sleep first. I used to get back out of bed and either pace about or play my games or something unproductive. Sometimes I'll lay there for hours, thinking about thoughts that refuse to be satisfied. I've told her it's like a slideshow that doesn't stop and cannot be ignored. Despite being encouraged to take sleeping tablets, I've always hesitated. I think it's an aversion to medication, clinical or over-the-counter. While Porridge rolled around on the floor, flicking toy carrots and chewing old books I had started but never finished, I laid with her head on my chest for hours. I laid there for hours, listening to her breathe. I thought about all the sockets that need to be turned off, the silence of the stairwell underneath us, what my coworkers had mentioned to me at work, but most importantly, the hole in the wall. I checked the time, and it was sometime around late 9 p.m., or maybe the early minutes of 10. I got out of bed after maneuvering her head off of me. Her black hair lay out across the white bed sheets, like a charcoal crime scene. I laid on the floor of the bedroom and began to look at the hole. I placed my head adjacent to it. I was close, but not so close that I placed my eye over the hole. It was a few inches from my face. It was impossibly dark. It seemed as though the fluorescent light was just avoiding the hole completely. I knew quickly that I wouldn't be able to sleep until I could answer all my questions. I grabbed my phone, turned on the torch, and continuously attempted to get several different angles that would allow me to see past the phone while ensuring that the hole was entirely lit. It couldn't be done. Finally, I started recording with the flashlight on. I pressed my phone against the penny-like divot to see if I could see anything. I stared at the camera screen with intensity as I moved the torch from left to right over the hole. The white wall became luminescent, but the hole in the wall consumed the light. It was late, but I knew that Alice would understand. I needed her there. I gently awoke her and showed her the recording. After a couple minutes of watching the video on replay and gradually coming to reality, she sat upright and watched closely. I could see her brain working as she watched the video. She didn't understand it. I remember thinking, thank God, it's not just me. It was rapidly approaching 11 p.m., and she furrowed her brow as she played the video for the last time. I explained everything that happened to her, the both of us drowning in our lack of answers. There was something lodged in my throat somewhere between anxiety and dread. She asked if she could try herself. We reasoned that maybe because my phone is a few generations behind hers, it might have glitched or bugged or something vague that could briefly fill in our gap of logic. She assumed the same position I had taken moments ago. and followed my exact motions that I had just shown her. It was the same. The hole in the wall was eating any light that came in and revealed nothing. Alice pressed her nail into the hole and asked me to do the same. Neither of us could feel an end to the hole. It was just too narrow to get further. That anxiety began to fester once more, and after we'd established that the hole was deeper, we then had to address the question that filled me with a bubbling horror. How deep was it? We sat there with both our flashlights on, breathing in the silence. After a few moments, Alice asked me to get a thin metal straw from the kitchen. She placed the tip of the metal straw at the entrance of the hole and continued to record while the flashlight was on. She told me that the metal might reflect the light and that we could also get a sense of how deep this hole actually was from the straw. The light illuminated the silver metal, but still revealed nothing about the hole. We both sat there while she slowly pushed the straw further and further. There was no resistance. She couldn't feel any grooves in the side of the wall. I watched as the hole continued to devour the straw. The atmosphere was still. Neither of us said a word. Neither of us blinked. It wasn't possible. Alice had the straw about 7 or so inches into the wall. There was little room for her to hold it, but she pinched it between her fingers and rested it between her fingers and the drill hole. I told her to stay there and not to push it any further. She asked why, and I just begged her to not push it any further. I hurriedly grabbed a pair of shoes, kept my flashlight on, and grabbed my keys. I left the apartment with the light outside the front door turning on as I swung the door open. I stood at the top of the stairs, paralyzed. It was late, and I know that I didn't hear anyone from the moment Alice and I went to bed. There was no gentle hum of electricity, no footsteps ascending or descending the stairs. I swallowed hard. I don't know how long I stood outside our door, staring down the staircase at the lights for the floor below. Steady, constant, flooding the floor with bright light. I strained to keep my eyes open underneath the flickering fluorescent, as all lights did when they were alerted to someone's presence. I don't even remember how long I held my breath for. It was only after a few beats that I realized that I was even holding my breath. I stared at the dirty carpet connecting the floor together, almost scared to look at the light. I remember holding the handrail so tight I saw the white in my knuckles. I walked down slowly. I'd like to pretend it was out of courtesy for my neighbors, but it was out of pure fear. I felt as though the cramped landing connecting the entire floor together would somehow harbor something that wasn't aware of my presence as long as I didn't breathe or make any noise. I felt like a deer braving a busy motorway, trying to avoid making eye contact with the rushing headlights. I checked every corner. I checked the stairs, and I checked the roof. I couldn't see it. The metal straw was nowhere to be seen. There would be at least 5 inches of metal sticking out of the thin walls of our apartment, or, as I had thought, through the floor. I stared at the dirty white roof for so long. I knew I wouldn't find anything. I couldn't stop looking. I continuously looked over the banister, then rapidly back behind me, checking if anyone was coming or if anyone was behind me. I couldn't believe how much I was sweating. I could feel my pajamas cling to my body as I swung myself around multiple times. I walked backwards up the stairs, keeping an eye on the floor. I stood outside our door for a few moments. It couldn't have been more than 10 seconds, as I watched the motion-activated lights switch off. I couldn't believe how quiet it felt at that moment. I threw my keys in the key bowl and ran back into the bedroom and told Alice everything. She said nothing. We looked at each other, sharing a feeling that couldn't be verbalized. After several seconds of eye contact, without either of us saying a word, she had let go of the last inch of straw. After a second or two, you could hear it. The metal straw struck something hard. It ricocheted off of a hard surface. Something wooden or something concrete. You could recognize the sound of the straw striking the ground and rapidly tapping the surface as it began to find its balance and stop rolling. After a few seconds, the noise had stopped altogether. Alice grabbed my hand, cold with sweat and hot with fear. She steadied just how much I was shaking. All I could hear was my heart pounding. I felt it in my teeth. I felt Alice grab my hand. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. We heard footsteps. subscribe for part 2. But as one nightmare fades, another begins to take shape. I used to work a really strange job, part 1 series. I used to work a really strange job several years ago. It's probably something that you would have never thought about, but I swear to you, it was real. It was at a defunct state prison in a major city in Pennsylvania. The prison was closed. There were no inmates, guards, or any other people. There was only me, or rather, whoever was on duty that day. We worked 24-hour shifts all by ourselves. We'd show up at 5 a.m. and relieve the guy who was there, and then at 5 a.m. the next day, someone would relieve you. It was actually really nice. I only worked a handful of days a month. The pay was decent for a college student. I was finishing my degree at the time, and the work was really easy. I wasn't expected to do much. A couple times a day, I had to walk around the inside and outside of the prison to make sure no one was in there. Other than that, sometimes I had to mow a small patch of grass in the admin parking lot, or use an ATV to plow snow out of that lot in the winter. The state still owned the prison, but was doing nothing with it. Honestly, I think the only reason we were there was to make sure people didn't break in, hurt themselves somehow, and then sue the state, because the state, was not interested in spending any more money on that prison than they absolutely had to. There was no heat or air conditioning, nor was there any running water. There was a porta potty in the Sally sort for our business, and we did have a propane-heated camp shower setup that we could use, but we had to bucket in the water. I think we were lucky that the lights were still on, but they sure as hell never replaced a light bulb. Actually, the only time I ever saw someone there from the state was when they came one time to take a bunch of razor wire down to send to another, still operating prison. Since we were there for a full 24 hours alone, we were allowed to sleep. One of the newer buildings was the administration building, and in that building was the Sally port. We were able to open the door, so we parked in there, the control room, and our shower. The control room was where we were headquartered and contained all our creature comforts. That is a cot, a coffee maker, a mini fridge, a 24-inch Roku TV, and a hotspot. Most of the controls in the room no longer functioned, but there were a few that we could still use. In the hallway outside the control room, there were 3 large metal doors that opened and closed on a track. I don't know what they are actually called, but we called them the blast doors. On led to the Sally port. One led further into the prison to the main yard, and one led to the main entrance. Only one blast door could be open at a time. There was also the door to the empty armory in this hallway, and the door to that would only open if all 3 blast doors were closed. To open and close the doors, there were 3 switches in the control room. Above each switch was a light. Red meant it couldn't be moved, green meant it was good to go. Turning the switch counterclockwise opened the corresponding door. Turning the switch clockwise closed the door. There was a separate button to unlock the armory. Needless to say, with all exterior doors locked, the 3 blast doors closed, and the control room deadbolt closed, the control room felt as good as Fort Knox. Again, with no heating or cooling, the room was kept at a livable temperature with an electric heater or an oscillating fan, depending on what you needed. I never really used the TV, but I would use the hotspot to play online games on a laptop that I'd bring with me. I fooled myself into thinking that I'd do schoolwork with it, but let's be honest, that rarely was the case. The cot wasn't bad. I think they put a mattress from one of the cells on it because there was an ugly white and blue striped mattress that wasn't half bad to lay on. With a blanket and pillow that I brought from Hal, I got many decent nights' sleep in that room. All in all, it was a decent gig. It wasn't really until now, several years later, that I began to remember and realize some strange things happened to me while I worked there. I decided to sit down and write about some of my experiences and thought that you all would like to read about them. I'll start with just this one, and if there is interest, I'll write about some of the others. Like I said, one of my main duties was to walk around this deserted prison a couple times a day and make sure that no one else was in there. My whole time working there, about 6 or 7 months, I never found anyone on the property. In order for the state to know that we were actually doing what we were supposed to do, We had these little plastic dots spread all over the prison in different areas and buildings. We had a little handheld device that we would use to go and scan these dots. One of these dots was in the cafeteria building. This building was in the middle of the main yard. It was separate from all the other buildings. Inside was a large industrial kitchen and a big empty room that used to be the main cafeteria. Hitting this room, scanning the dot, was really easy, and I usually did it on my cell block round. In order to keep myself somewhat busy, I split the prison up into a couple different sections and would check each section at different times of the day, usually visiting each section at least twice in a 24-hour period. Anyway, the cafeteria was one of my first stops during my cell block round and was little more than a drive-by. The building had 2 doors that were propped open all the time, one facing the building with the control room and the other facing the cell blocks on the other side of the yard. The dot was by the cell block door. So on my way to the blocks, I would just walk through the one door across the large empty room and scan the dot on my way through the other door. On this particular day, I was doing what I always do. I walked through the open door and proceeded through the cafeteria. I was maybe 15 or 20 feet into the room, not even halfway, when one of the loudest noises I have ever heard in my life erupted from behind me. The bang was deafening. It echoed and reverberated through the empty tile and cinder block room. In that moment, the fear, panic, and adrenaline hit me so hard that my senses were dialed to 11s. I could feel every hair on my body stand on end. I could feel my skin and hear my heart beat. The cold shiver that rocketed down my spine exploded into every inch of my body. I whipped around toward the origin of the sound, not knowing what to expect. I had never felt this sort of response from my body before, and I honestly, even to this day, could not tell you what I would have done if the situation had not been what it was. That is, it was just the door. It had slammed shut. Almost immediately, I felt my body relax. I started breathing again, which made me aware that I had stopped in the first place. Then the embarrassment came. I couldn't believe that I had gotten so frightened. What did I think it was? So, feeling like an idiot and suddenly very tired from the shock of adrenaline leaving my system, I finished the rest of my round and went back to the control room. It wasn't until later that evening, while gaming with my brother and recounting the story to him, obviously downplaying how scared I'd been, that he brought up a question that I had not considered. How did the door just suddenly slam shut? What was keeping it open in the first place? I thought for a moment. Like some of the other doors that were being held open in the prison, I was fairly sure that a large stone, about the size of a soccer ball, was set in front of the door to keep it from closing. At the idea, the familiar cold slithered down my spine and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I endured the feeling for only a moment before I shook it off, got a cup of coffee, told my brother to shut up. He was laughing at me for being a sissy. I used the game we were playing to distract me from what I didn't want to think about. It must have worked because I didn't think about it again that night. Actually, I didn't think about it again until a few days later when I was back for another shift. I went out for my morning cell block round when I came face to face with the door again. It was standing there, wide open with a large rock placed in front of it. I walked over and checked it. It would have been impossible for the door to have slipped over it. It was a heavy rock and stuck up an inch or two above the bottom of the door. I thought that maybe it was at the side of the door, and the door slipped past it, and when whoever put it back, put it right in the middle so that wouldn't happen again. That made sense to me, so I continued my investigation. I squatted down and pushed the stone out from in front of the door. The door just hung there. It didn't even move. It didn't even sway, let alone slam shut. The chills began to slowly return. I checked the hydraulic, automatic door closing mechanism at the top of the door. It was disconnected. I pushed the stone back as the panic began to well in my throat. Maybe it was disconnected after the fact, or it might have broken when it slammed. I hadn't noticed at the time, but maybe it was really windy and the door slipped from the stone and a strong gale slammed it shut. That has to be what happened. I am embarrassed even now to admit, but I did not enter that building again that day. Instead, I quickly walked around the outside of the building to the other door, stuck just as much of my arm as needed to scan the dot, and then continued on my regular route. I did eventually go back into the cafeteria, days if not weeks later. At some point, I completely forgot about the incident until I started recalling them again just recently. Even now, it is difficult for me to believe that something unexplainable happened. There are perfectly reasonable explanations for why that door had slammed closed. That's what I told myself. That's what I forced myself to believe. And I did believe it. But now, after remembering more of what happened there, I'm not so sure. Looking back at my time there, I feel as though I was lying to myself, forcing myself to ignore all the strangeness. As I sit here and remember now, I can recall more events that begin to be harder and harder to explain away. And I remember that at the time of those events, when I was there, I was terrified. But it is almost like once I left the prison, I forgot. I forgot about what happened. I forgot about the fear. I actively have to force myself to remember. Now that I feel afraid again, and I don't know why. As I write this, the hairs on my arms tingle and stand on end. At risk of sounding paranoid, I almost feel like I shouldn't be remembering. It's like my mind and body are protesting when I try to. I will, though, if you want me to. I'm going to post this and see how it does. If people want more, I will try to remember more. There are already a couple instances that I vaguely remember, but I don't want to go through the process of remembering and writing them if no one wants to read them. I will try to keep an eye on the comments and respond when I can. Thank you. The darkness holds many more secrets. Let's explore the next one together. Who is the Long Man? Hi guys, posting this here as I'm hoping someone might be able to help. Given the kind of stuff you talk about, I'm guessing one of you might have had a similar experience. For context, I'm a 26-year-old man and a little under 5'8". I've always been a bit heavier than most, a bit like a ball. My parents used to say, and I still probably do, carry a bit too much weight for where I should be in my life right now. I mention this really only because suddenly, I don't look like this. No one says I look different in person, and in photos I still look normal, if a bit awkward. But in the past week, my reflection is different, like really different. A different person, and it's making me do things I do not want to do. I was out a few days ago. It was nothing more than a couple of drinks. Honestly, I was sober. I could have driven if I had to. I got home, went to splash some water over my face and brush my teeth before bed, and it was just there in the mirror. A long man. I caught my first sight of a gaunt face. I recoiled and threw my hands down. Staring back at me was a different man. Skin clung to his cheekbones. His hair parted naturally and beautifully to the left. But most of all, I remember his eyes. They were definitely my eyes, deep and brown, and maybe a bit tired, but they framed a pointy nose and stared at me with no emotion. They were a good 2 inches higher than they should have been. I was looking up at myself, but it wasn't me. I blinked. I remember blinking a lot, and every time I opened my eyes, I'd see his eyes flickering open again. I raised my hands over my eyes, and he would do the same. His hands. They were delicate and bony, longer and thinner than mine, but they would move with mine, and like mine do. I broke my little finger when I was a teenager, and I still can't fully extend it. This long man in the mirror couldn't either. It sat there slightly crooked, but otherwise pristine. The only thing that did not mirror me was his smile. He had one, a slight trace of a smirk or contentment or something else like that. It just sat there, never moving, no matter how I contorted my face. If I tilted my head, he would track me, but that smirk just sat there. At first, I thought I had drunk more than I thought, so I decided to just write it off. It's me being silly, or some kind of pre-sleep dream. I turned out the light and went to bed without brushing my teeth. I just wanted to fall unconscious and forget about it. It would be better in the morning. I'd had a few drinks. The mind does strange things. Of course, I lay awake most of the night. There's a mirror on a shelf in my room. I tried to sleep with my back to it. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to get ready in the morning without seeing your reflection. It's quite difficult. I decided I didn't need to shave, and I brushed my teeth with my eyes closed. There was curiosity in me, but I was just too scared of what I would do if I confirmed that the long man was still there. I was tired, and I wasn't thinking straight. What would I even say to people if they asked why I looked so hollow that day? I suppose I would have just said I was hungover. In my head, it was just better to pretend that it hadn't happened. The only time I saw myself that morning was a quick glance in the mirror that sits on the inside of my wardrobe door when I went to get my coat. I don't remember it well, but looking back, when my shoulder brushed against the glass, my reflection that touched it was half a foot further up the image. Luckily, I walked to work. I kept my eyes fixed on the pavement for the whole journey. It wasn't until I needed the loo in the office that I had to come face to face with myself, or this new version of myself. I waited until I thought no one else was in the toilets. Should the worst happen, I didn't want to seem like a madman. I washed my hands, and there he was again, staring back at me. This long man with the same eyes but greater height and the same body but leaner. That fixed smile was still there, but now the lips were slightly pursed. He looked happier than he had the night before. Even though I had tried to steel myself for the moment, I still flinched slightly, but that smile soothed me enough to regain some composure. For the first time, I properly took in the long man's physique. Every here and there was some similarity to me. As I said, he still had my eyes, and he wore my clothes. They hung off him a bit more, and a slight sleeve bulge suggested more tone in his arm muscles than mine, but they were recognizably the same. The hint of yellow on the inside of the collar from overwearing the shirt. The crooked little finger of the left hand. I remember that in that moment I felt almost reassured. His presence was calming, and he looked like me, but a bit better. What shocked me was when I looked more closely into his eyes. I brought my face right into the mirror to see how similar our skin was, whether there was the hint of the growing crow's feet I had started noticing, and it was there that I saw his mouth more closely. In that slight crack between the long man's lips, I could see the edge of a couple of teeth. For the first time, there was a tangible difference between us. Each edge was set diagonally. They were jagged, and though I couldn't see the whole of them at that time, they looked to all the world like fangs. My own mouth dropped open. I wish I could say it was deliberate, that I was trying to get the long man to confirm what was in his mouth. But no, I was just dumbstruck. My hands involuntarily jumped up to run fingers over my own teeth. They felt normal, but as I glanced back at the mirror, at the long man's hands trying to feel for his, all I saw was his hands disappear behind those lips, those unmoving lips. It looked like a mistake with green screen or something, nothing like anything I've seen in real life. I turned my head and just ran out the door. I leaned on the wall outside the toilets and tried to dry my hands on my trousers. One of my colleagues walked past and asked if the dryer was broken. I heard the words, "No, I'm just miles away," fall out of my mouth. He asked if I was okay, and I nodded in silence as he disappeared through the door. I thought I was going mad, and I don't know if anyone else has ever experienced this, but I felt like I just clicked into autopilot. I went straight back to my desk and asked the guy sitting next to me that day to take a picture of me. I made up some rubbish about needing to update my work profile picture. He huffed and agreed. We found a blank wall for me to stand in front of, and he snapped a quick, poorly framed image. I didn't care. "Do you want several?" he asked in a friendly enough way. "How does it look now?" I replied quickly, very quickly. "Well, you look like you." He glanced down at the picture, and I exhaled audibly. "Are you sure you don't want to do this a different day, though? You look pretty tired." "No, that's fine, thanks. Thank you." And I did mean it. I looked at the picture and saw myself. No strange teeth, no extra inches, just me. At that point, I didn't know what to feel, but I could sense adrenaline slowly blending back into the background and my mind becoming clearer. My first thought was one of pure social embarrassment, and I made a mental note to change my profile picture immediately. If anyone asks why it was such a bad photo of me, I could say someone had stolen my face online and was posing as me. I simply had to change it immediately. That would make sense, wouldn't it? And it wasn't a million miles from what I thought was happening. My second thought brought back my fear. What was actually happening? I decided I would wait a bit and go back to the bathroom. Maybe the night before I had been drunker than I thought, and now I was tired and so worked up about it that I'd seen what I wanted, or rather, really did not want to see. After all, now I had confirmation, a picture no less, that I was still me. And though I didn't really know anyone well in the office, no one had called me out as an imposter. Well, I'm writing this now for a reason, aren't I? The fucking lawn man was there in the mirror, smiling away at me. His two eyes looked down on me with a new frown above them. He didn't look calming anymore. My blood chilled, and though before I felt ill at ease, now all of a sudden I felt genuinely threatened, like a police officer or soldier was looming over me, holding me at gunpoint. I picked up my hand to see if his finger was still crooked before slapping myself, cleanly and loudly, in the cheek, trying to knock some sense into me. I shook my head before looking back up at the mirror. The frown had gone, but the lawn man remained. I just couldn't do it anymore. I marched straight out the toilets and to my desk to pack my things, muttering to anyone who needed to know that I'd be working from home the rest of the day. I had some plumbers coming to fix some stuff in the bathroom. No one really minded, and I knew one missed afternoon of work would have no ill effects in the long run. Admin jobs, right? I went straight home, shut all the blinds so they wouldn't start reflecting into the room when the sun set, and threw towels or sheets or whatever else I could find over every reflective surface in the flat. I got straight into bed. I didn't eat anything, didn't drink anything, just lay there staring at the ceiling for hours before exhaustion got the better of me. In the morning? This morning, by the way. I needed to shave. I just felt so dirty and haggard. I needed to sit in a bath for hours and shave, just get everything off my body that didn't belong. Most of that was fine, but it's not fun trying to shave blind, and honestly, I wish I'd invested in some electric razor before now. I just always liked a wet shave more. It feels cleaner. It had to be done, though. I just felt unclean. I thought I could do it while keeping the sheet I'd hung over the bathroom mirror up, my free hand following the razor and feeling for what was left. It was fine until I hit the corner of my lip. As my finger traced the contour, it slipped and knocked my shaving hand sideways, leaving a gash a couple of millimeters wide just next to my mouth. I hissed in pain and swore. I dabbed at it and saw the diluted blood on the end of my finger. Just in case any of you think I'm being rash and not taking appropriate care of myself with all this going on, I knew I needed to look at the damage and cover this up. I am being sensible. I lifted the corner, just the corner of the sheet up. I was scared, of course, but hey, I was bleeding, needs must. There were thoughts in my head of what to expect, but no matter how much I steeled myself, I couldn't help recoiling in terror. I could see the cut. It was sure as hell there, but rather than it being where it should have been, on my puckered cheek so I could get a good look, it emerged from the long man's beaming grin, manically. He was bent forward in the mirror and stooping so I could clearly that it was him. He wanted me to know it was him, and he was there without me needing to move. He was so happy with himself. I couldn't see his eyes, but it was him, the elongated arm, the smile wider than ever. Only his teeth looked different to before. Maybe I had just misremembered from work, but now they looked normal, just a whole lot whiter and neater than mine. I've seen him since, but that specific smile is still burned into mind. I know it's strange to think about, and I don't know if it's just where I am in my life right now, in a starter job, living alone, but he looked pleased with me. And that almost felt good. I was terrified but warm. You read people's horror stories about blood running cold, but at this moment, with my blood actually running, I had the lawn man's reassurance that I had pleased him somehow. And it was strangely warming. There was too much on my mind, so I called up my friend Tom and asked if I could come over. I could sort, taking the day off work, and he works shifts so was often home in the middle of the day. Thankfully, he was in and offered me lunch. Honestly, I felt relieved. I'd seen him back on Tuesday at the pub, back when everything was normal. Maybe he could reframe the whole thing, explain what had happened, whether it was all just bad beer or something. I fell asleep on the bus, so missed my stop. It rained as I walked over, and I was grateful for the cold on my face. The first thing he said when he answered the door was, "I look different." I held my breath. "What have you done to your face?" "Oh," I said flatly, I cut myself shaving. And you say you're an adult. Come inside. I've always liked going to his. He has roommates, and they all went in on quite a nice house recently renovated, and one that actually has living space. A kitchen diner of all things. Nicely polished. He sat me down and asked what was wrong. He hadn't heard me this flustered since my last breakup. Has Charlotte been speaking to you? No, of course not. I haven't so much as said hi to a woman for weeks. I told him the whole thing, as crazy as it sounds. I knew it was crazy, and it still feels crazy now, even though now I know it's real. He let me go through the whole thing without interrupting, looking sympathetic enough, and a bit concerned. Only at the end did he say, "Mate, you look awful, but you look like you. You've cut your face up and you've barely slept, but it's you." I suddenly felt like an idiot. A reassured idiot, yes, but still so stupid. I think it was that reassurance that made me confident enough to nod when he asked if I wanted him to stand next to me as I looked in a mirror. The knot that has started tying itself in my stomach every time I get near a mirror now was still there, and I flinched when he positioned me in front of the bathroom cabinet. "What do you see? Describe it to me." There was a slight hint of comedy or frustration in his delivery. It was me. There was no long man. He had gone, or he hadn't followed me. I felt like an idiot all over again. I asked him what he saw in the mirror. "You're looking like an idiot standing next to me. Come on, let's have some food. You need some." As he went downstairs, I didn't look back over my shoulder at the mirror. We were back in the kitchen when he asked me to help him cook. He pushed some carrots and a chopping board over to me. "Knives in the top drawer on your left." I knew that, of course. The specifics of what's in a mirror at any one time aside, my memory is quite good. He started monologuing, I think to distract me, about work. He's a police officer and is working tonight, so he wanted something that would keep him awake for the start of his shift. He was right by my side until he turned to flick the stove on. I looked up to register interest in what he was saying. He'd relaxed me so much that I'd forgotten about the metallic splashback that runs all along the kitchen counters. In that hazy metal, I saw him again. The long man. He was stooped down in the mirror to meet my gaze. Those deep eyes behind a craning nose. I felt the breath leave my body. For the first time, he broke eye contact. That shocked me. He was alive. He wasn't me. His eyes flickered rapidly and eagerly between mine and the slender, sharp knife in my right hand. His mouth parted slightly, like when you raise a glass to your mouth, ready to drink. I didn't feel myself move my right arm over my left. I was staring into his eyes as they sped up. I was in his face, and he was in mine. His teeth jumped between the neat row and the jagged fangs. His hair, my hair now, bristled. The knife was over my left wrist. Wah. Tom snapped me out of the trance. "Mate, what are you doing? I'm still at his now." He gave me some water. It's in a frosted cup. I'm on his sofa, and he's called in sick. The thing is, I'm not suicidal. I know that, and so does he. I'm on the sofa, under a blanket, and feel good that he's around still. I thought it would get better. I feel a bit better that Tom's still here. The problem is, as I've been writing this, he's just came back from the bathroom. I thought he would ask me how I was doing. He didn't. He just looked white and asked me, very calmly, whether he looks taller than he did earlier. I don't know what's going on. We both need to know what the fuck is going on. I want to just post this and hope someone knows what's going on. I want to just click post. But I'm holding off and steeling myself to make sure I don't just do the automatic thing of clicking the lock button. When the screen goes black, even if I just see it for a second, I don't know who will be looking back at me. I don't know what he'll make me do. Please. Has anyone ever experienced or heard of anything like this?